This is Jocko podcast number 465 with Echo Charles and me, Jocko Willink. Good evening, Echo.
Good evening.
As we advanced, each one of us could see that all around us, the Somalis were coming. Every second, resistance and enemy fire began to increase. The cracks of Somali rifle fire were constant now, overhead and around us. The Somalis were massing, and we could see the crowds still blocks away, but beginning to surge towards us. Aideed's militiamen aggressively moved through the alleys around us and along the walls, firing and rapidly closing. They were reinforced by men and boys from the neighborhoods, joining in and carrying their AK-47 rifles. Rushing forward through the increasing fire, the assault force quickly covered 2 blocks, then turned left. We headed north toward the crash site, still a few hundred meters away and beyond our vision, but directly ahead. As we turned the corner and began to move north, we became awash in combat. Bullets zipped along the walls around us and cracked incessantly overhead. Dust rose as Somali gunmen fired and ducked behind cover or were cut down by the Americans. Now, as the firefight began to rage, there was no hesitation over the rules of engagement. At the same time that we closed with the attacking Somalis, our column remained spread back toward the target building. It bogged down to a stop when the fight erupted in earnest all around us. The Rangers and operators in the assault force were taking cover, firing and maneuvering against the numerous attacking Somalis streaming into the streets. And that right there is an excerpt from a book called With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia, written by retired Army Lieutenant Colonel James Lechner. Colonel Lechner served 27 years in the Army, and he fought around the world, in addition to fighting in Somalia, where he fought the battle that was recounted in the book and the movie Black Hawk Down. He was actually on the aircraft flown by Mike Durant, the pilot who was eventually shot down and captured by Somalis, who was on this podcast, number 312. But Jim Lechner fast roped off that helo, fought in the battle, was eventually wounded, but he survived, he recovered, and he carried on and fought in Bosnia, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq. And in Iraq, I was honored to serve alongside him in the Battle of Ramadi, where he was the deputy commander of the Ready First Brigade and helped lead the fight to secure that city from insurgents and turn it over to the peaceful citizens of Ramadi. And it's an honor to have Colonel Lechner here with us tonight to discuss his experiences and lessons learned. Jim, thanks for joining us. Good to see you.
Oh, thank you, Jocko. It's an honor to be here. Great to see you again.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
I guess I haven't seen you since I left in Ramadi in October of 2006.
Yeah, almost 2 decades, yeah.
It goes by quick, doesn't it? Before we jump into this book, or I guess as we jump into this book, you and I had to put the brakes on even talking to you, because once you showed up, right. I just wanted to talk about a million different things, because everything you've done since you first joined the Army and when you were with me, and you did so much more after that. So much to talk about. But let's start at the beginning a little bit. So you're from upstate New York.
Yeah, I was born in a town of Chili, just outside of Rochester, upstate, about 55 miles from Canada.
That is definitely up north. And your mom, did your mom work?
Yeah, she was a nurse.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then your dad worked for Kodak, which is pretty common up there.
Yep, he did 4 years in the Marine Corps, and then he got out and worked for Kodak. That's right.
What did he do in the Marine Corps?
Aviation. He was an air crew.
What years? Was he in Vietnam, or was he earlier than that?
Just prior to Vietnam, 56 to like 59. So there was some UN missions they went on in Indochina prior to the Vietnam thing kicking off in 59. So he had 1 or 2 missions, but just prior to Vietnam.
How much did he talk to you about the Marine Corps?
A little bit. He was always proud of it. He was worked for Kodak, and he was a volunteer fireman.
Okay.
He was a battalion chief in the local fire department, and so parades and all that, he'd be in charge of drill and ceremony. And so he always, wore his hair high and tight, and he was proud of being in the Marine Corps, but not a lot, but he's proud of it.
And then your dad was from a devout Catholic family.
That's right. Yeah.
But your mom was Southern Baptist. So you got a little bit of a mixture there.
Oh, yeah.
The best of both worlds.
Yeah, really interesting because my mother's family were all Mormons out in Salt Lake, and then her mom got killed in a car wreck when she was 2, and so she got sent back. Some family, and the aunt that raised her was Southern Baptist. Otherwise, they were all Mormons. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, raised Southern Baptist. My mother was. And
then you also had this interesting point in the book that you were in the Boy Scouts,
right?
And your Boy Scout leader was this old German immigrant.
That's right.
That was raised in the Hitler Youth.
His Boy Scout experience was the Hitler Youth, yeah. And his dad was smart enough in the 30s to get them out and go to Africa, but he did a number of years in the Hitler Youth and still had his Hitler Youth knife.
Yeah, you were saying he'd bring that thing out on patrol with you guys.
Right.
And then you went to Gates Chili Public High School.
Yeah, like most places, they pronounce it Gates Chili.
I didn't know that.
They pronounce words differently than everybody else, So, Gates Chili. That's where I went to school, wrestled a little bit, played football, did well in history, did not do well in math. So,
how into wrestling were you?
Just a couple years.
And then what about football?
Yeah, I played football all the way through. I'm not that big, so I it was a lot of fun, like to hit, but yeah. And then I did a little bit of track too, just getting ready for the military, a little bit, get some more running in there. So
that was an interesting thing that in the book you talk about. You would tell people, I want to be a professional soldier, which is an interesting term. It's not, because I always tell people when I was a kid, I wanted to be a commando.
Right.
And maybe I would have said soldier, but I never would have thought of the words professional soldier. That's next level. You must. And where did that idea come from?
Yeah, so I liked doing Army stuff, shooting and all, and I liked Boy Scouts. Like I said, an intensive Boy Scout troop, to say the least. But I was into history also, so I'd study Patton and generals and their professional careers. That's where I kind of got the idea. I just wanted to follow in their footsteps. I wanted to be a soldier, but I wanted to be a professional officer, kind of in the genre of Patton and all that. And so then
after your junior year you enlist and you go to boot camp your junior year.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's that. Do they still do that? Can you still do that?
It's the programs change year to year based on recruiting. But yeah, at the time you could be 17 years old. Your parents could sign. You could still be in high school. They'd send you down in the summer and you'd knock out basic training and then come back and finish. And that's what I did. And I enlisted in the National Guard. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to get in as soon as I could. At that point, I just wanted to be in the Army and be a soldier. So that was the quickest way to get in. I knew I was going to go to college and go regular Army, but that was just the quickest way to get in and get some training.
So a kid that I knew did that.
Yeah.
And he was older than me. And when he was down there in boot camp, and this is kind of my origin story here, Echo Charles. I'll give you my origin story. He was down there at boot camp. And they're kind of almost done with boot camp.
Yeah.
And they're standing out on some parade field down at Benning. And there's a guy running around the track with cami pants, no shirt, a ruck, long hair. And my buddy goes, "Hey, drill sergeant, who's that guy?" And he said his drill sergeant didn't even look at him, just kept looking at the guy that was running. Didn't look at my buddy, and he just goes, "Delta." And my buddy goes, "Drill sergeant, is there anyone tougher than Delta?" And the drill sergeant goes, without looking, just says, "SEAL team." And so that's when I heard that story, I was probably like 13. I was like, all right, I know what I'm doing.
Right.
Of course, no offense to the Delta guys and everybody else, but that idea of going in your junior year is pretty epic. And you write this in the book. The trainee platoon to which I now belonged was the typical cross-section of America, from inner-city blacks and Hispanics to Kentucky hillbillies. We'd spend nearly every minute of the next 9 weeks eating, sleeping, training, and working together in our platoons. We got to know each other well, and while individual personalities carried on especially among the recruits, it was my first experience with the true concept of a melting pot. Wearing our uniforms, we all looked the same, and our lives were regimented to the minute. by ever-present drill sergeants. The accents, attitudes, and many of the differences faded, giving way to the traditions and military culture of infantry soldiers. Along with the rest of my platoon, I spent that summer as a young infantry trainee in loud, mostly one-way discussions with drill sergeants, tactics instructors, and infantry officers. They taught us the basic skills of the trade along with the lore and ways of the U.S. Army. In basic training, the Army's version of boot camp, this mainly consisted of spending days and nights in the sandy hills and pine forest, marching, running, shooting, weapons, digging foxholes, and placing mines, learning first aid, and a myriad of other combat tasks. I walked for miles with the ruck on my back and carrying a rifle until it felt like part of my limbs. In basic training, we carried the M16A2 rifle, a slightly updated version of the weapon made famous during the Vietnam War. Many of our leaders at Fort Benning were Vietnam veterans, as the last U.S. troops had left that war-torn country less than a decade before. As these veterans helped turn us into soldiers, they passed on lessons learned not only from the Army field manuals, but also through their own combat experience. During basic training that summer, many of them inspired us by their example, leading from the front. One of these leaders was our brigade commander, Colonel Steve Siegfried. He had taken a machine gun bullet through his hip in Vietnam and thus limped along, but he was always out in front of us on our unit runs. At the same time, we caught occasional glimpses of some of the Army's newest combat veterans from the 75th Ranger Regiment, which was then forming at Fort Benning. An entire regiment of Rangers was being established by the Army to include the newly formed 3rd Ranger Battalion. This expansion of the Ranger Regiment was a direct result of the previously established 1st and 2nd Ranger Battalions having proven their value by successfully spearheading the invasion of Grenada less than a year prior. The first 2 Ranger battalions of the modern era had been formed less than a decade before on the heels of the trauma in Vietnam and were now simultaneously the Army's spearhead for combat operations and the leading force in its revitalization. These Rangers were role models and living icons not only for young infantry recruits at Fort Benning, but for the entire Army. 8 weeks after arriving at Fort Benning, I completed basic training and went back home to upstate New York to finish my senior year in high school. So there's your kind of introduction to the Army.
That's right.
Was it easier than having a Hitler Youth commander of your Boy Scout troop?
In some ways, I didn't get beaten, so yeah, in some ways it was easier.
And then what's it like when you're when you get to do that boot camp experience and now you come back home and you're going to your senior year of high school? You must have had money to buy a car or something like that, at least.
Yeah, it was almost like a couple steps back, to get back into high school now. And it's like, really, do I have to go back, to do this kind of almost like games, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But ready to go. Mm-hmm. It was just basic training, so I'm not saying we were fully trained, ready to go to war, but definitely a different level of responsibility and achievement, maturity, and already looking down the road. So went back, and it was easy. High school, I went right back into double sessions of football. That was easy. It was kind of fun because everybody else was like laying out, all panting and dying, and I was just standing there ready to go to the next drill. So I was already in shape. So that was it was a good experience doing that, and then doing the rest of my senior year and ready to go.
Yeah, and there was a plane crash in the Potomac you talk about in the book, Air Florida, Flight 90, and this guy Arland D. Williams. He was this. A very few people survived the crash, but they were had made their way out of the plane, and they were waiting to get picked up in the freezing water. And this guy Arland D. Williams, when they put a rope down to rescue people, he didn't take the rope. He handed it off to other people, and eventually the plane sunk and he went down. And the news anchor pointed out that this guy Arland D. Williams was a graduate of the Citadel in South Carolina, and that school's harsh discipline had prepared him to be a hero.
That's right. So as I mentioned, history guy, and I was always kind of looking at West Point, Annapolis, and guys like Patton. And I knew through Patton and some things that there was another school called Virginia Military Institute, but I was looking around to see what else there might be, and I wasn't even aware of the Citadel until I was watching those events, and it just kind of struck me the way they described that. The harsh discipline had prepared him to be a hero. That really stuck with me, and I thought, this is a place I want to check out. So down in Charleston, South Carolina. And then, of course, I'm in upstate New York, and South Carolina sounded pretty good. So went down there and checked it out, and I knew that the minute I rolled into the gates, I knew that's where I was going to school.
Yeah, this is the Citadel. It was originally the South Carolina Military Academy in 1842 is when it was originally established. And you got some pretty cool history that you cover in the book. And by the way, I haven't said this. Get the book, everybody. I'm obviously going to read a couple highlights, but there's so much detail from this experience for you. Just get the book. It's an outstanding book. And one of the things that you cover is a little bit of the history behind the school. And this school, the South Carolina Military Academy, they actually had a cadet battery on Morris Island. And when President Lincoln sent down the USS, the Star of the West, which was a ship, the first shots of the Civil War were actually fired by cadets from the South Carolina Military Academy. That may have worked out well for the South Carolina Military Academy, but they lost the war eventually.
That's right.
The school shut down for 10 years, and then after losing the war, it was shut for 10 years, and then it reopened 10 years later, and then now they renamed it the Citadel.
That's right, yeah.
Really, it seems like a next level of harsh discipline, and that was sort of what you experienced there.
Yeah, without a doubt. Kind of apples and oranges or iron and nickel, I guess would be a better way to describe it, because Army basic training, very pragmatic, very physical, like I say, marching in the sun, shooting weapons. The Citadel, you're not doing a lot of that. It's mental. But at the time, you went through the plebe system, or the knob system, was 9 months long, and it was 24/7, and there was no getting away from it. It regulated everything you did. You couldn't have civilian clothes, very little time off, and very intensive. Rooms had to be kept in inspection order, and then very, very intensive pressure on you, just getting chewed out constantly, very harsh corrections made. They didn't necessarily hit you so much, but you're doing a lot of push-ups, you're doing a lot of different exercises and punishments and corrections, and being pointed in the right direction. And like I said, you couldn't get away from it at the Citadel. That's one of the big different things. Even in the military, there's usually you can get away from stuff. You've got your room, or you've got somewhere you can go, or there's a break. There's no break for 9 months with the Citadel. So at that time, in the early 80s or mid 80s, it was a different system, and it was very intensive, and it was a great. There's a couple different seminal points in my timeline of my personal development, and that's definitely one of the big ones. And it wasn't just a negative beat you down and then build you back up thing, but the whole aspect, at least for me, and this gets to the history that we're talking about with the Citadel, the long history that I talk about in the book, is why it's so important to me, is it really establishes this standard of what you should live up to. Your dedicated service to the nation, self-sacrifice, never complain, never advance your own interests over your teammates or over your nation. They really beat that into you, and that is the standard. Again, and it's 24/7. They beat into you that you got to live up to. And
so when you go to the Naval Academy or you go to West Point, at the Naval Academy they call it plebe summer.
Right.
At West Point it's called the Beast, right?
Right.
Those are probably like 9 weeks or something like that.
Right. And
for you at the Citadel, it's 9 months you're living like that.
That's right. Yeah, different military schools, even VMI and the ones you mentioned, you can all discuss and debate about who's tougher, who's better, et cetera, et cetera. But we had quantifiably the longest system. No one was as long as us. VMI's was about 2 months shorter than ours, I think, at that time. So we could bragging rights to the longest system and arguably the toughest system in the country at the time, and I was all about that.
So I had to square my meals, which I read about you have in the book, when I went to officer candidate school, which was only 13 weeks, and we only had to square our meals for I think probably about 4 weeks. By the way, I lost 20 pounds squaring my meals. What that means, Echo Charles, you can't look at your plate. You just have to look straight ahead and put your fork into the plate and come straight up in front of your face and bring it in. It's real hard to eat. Did you have to square your meals for that many months?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And they kind of take it to the next level. You're only allowed to sit in the front 3 inches of your chair. You've got to do this this what looks ridiculous but is a good tool called bracing. So you have to like tense up your whole body and pull your chin in as hard as you can, an exaggerated position of attention. You had to eat like that. So you're getting the food up, trying to square it away, and also you're required to keep everybody else's food. You're the server at the table, and so the upperclassmen, you're serving them, and they know, and they're putting the pressure on you. So it's all about building stress, and we talk about that in the book. And I know this is something that you're more than familiar with, but it's all about building stress to see if you can persevere. And so at the Citadel, while you're not going through swamps and marching 20 Ks, there's other ways to induce stress, and that's definitely one of them.
Was there any challenges? First of all, how many people quit?
At the time, I think we had about 30% attrition rate.
Okay. But that's because people had applied and they know they're going to get a good career out of it. There's also, I think the Citadel has a really high percentage of people that actually go into the military.
Yeah, at the time they did. So it was, that's one of the weird things about the Citadel is you don't have to go in the military. And South Carolina is a whole different tribe within the United States, as some people know. But South Carolina kind of sees that as their military service, going to the Citadel, which is not, right? But they think that it is. And so a lot of guys would just do their 4 years and get out. So you didn't have to go into the U.S. military, but eventually 65, 75% did. So it's a pretty high rate.
And like you said, you'd already been through boot camp.
Right.
So you're just a glutton for punishment doing this stuff.
Yeah.
Was there anything that was significantly challenging for you?
The academics, and I found out now, because now that I've got a couple master's degrees and teach college, being 18 years old, that's what I was focused on. I was trying to find every opportunity to get a rifle in my hands, to get out in the field. You know what I'm talking about. So that's what I focused on, and what I really should have focused on was maybe studying math a little bit more. And I'd get up in the morning at 4:45 in PT. We actually had a sergeant from the Ranger Battalion there, and he ran a program. And so I'd get up in the morning, PT with him, and then I'm falling asleep through class all day. So maybe a little more balance, a little more pragmatic approach to things. It's great that I could do my PT test, but you probably need to pass that math test to graduate. So.
And this whole time you're still a National Guard soldier. Yep. So you get done with your NOB year, which is your freshman year in college, and then you go to the infantry course at Fort Benning.
That's right, yeah.
So you were a heavily indoctrinated individual.
Yeah. And I won't say I was thrilled to get those orders at the end of NOB year, go right back to the infantry school. But no, I was, and it was a great experience. And so I was doing National Guard on the weekend. They had a cadet ranger company that this guy from 175 ran, and I do that like every weekend. And so, not a whole lot of balance going on there. And then after NOB year, I went right into the infantry school, and it was good training in those years. It was Reagan years, a lot of money, still Vietnam vets running it very good. And then I got selected to come back to the Citadel and run the cadre, run the training for the freshmen. So I had to show up early, so I went basically right from the infantry school to that. So nonstop process. You
were, like I said, a heavily indoctrinated human.
That's a good word, yeah. Indoctrinated. I was indoctrinated.
And then you end up serving in the National Guard unit, mechanized unit, right there outside the gates of the Citadel.
Yep, I'd walk right out the gate and go to drill, and we do that for 1 weekend a month. And
as you're getting ready to graduate, or any other big things, takeaways? I mean, again, you talk about this in the book, but anything you want to mention about the Citadel in general before we get to your graduation?
Again, just to emphasize, there's different ways to train people for combat, and the Citadel's not a real physical place, but it's a very mentally grueling place, and it's all about finding ways to make the individual reach down and persevere and keep pushing, and especially building that concept that if you quit, you're letting down the guys to your left and your right, and that's really what's an important thing that I was taught throughout most of this training, but at the Citadel especially.
So you graduate. When you graduate, I'm going to go to the book here. You say, earlier that year, we had filled out forms to request which branch or job we wanted to enter. Though the forms had spaces for us to list 10 choices to be ranked in order of our preference, I only filled in one, with infantry. When our branches were posted that spring, to my shock and dismay, I was assigned to the field artillery, a branch I had not requested. Further, it seemed like an unlikely match given my recent struggles with math. I protested using the chain up through the senior Army leadership of ROTC at the Citadel, but to no avail. I would follow my orders and march off that summer to the U.S. Army's artillery school in Oklahoma. So that had to be a bit of a shock.
Oh, yeah, very shocking. You know, obviously math wasn't considered when you talk about artillery officers. You know, no math involved there, U.S. Army. But, yeah, it was my first taste of Army bureaucracy. And I think anybody that's been in the military can attest there's two different sides to the military. There's a bureaucratic side and there's a field or actual the soldier warrior side. And so this is my first taste of bureaucracy, just putting pegs in holes is all they were doing, and that's what and so I learned from that, though, as we'll see later on. But the bureaucracy just stuck me in the artillery. Now, as it turns out, fantastic experience, broadened my mind hugely. I got practical application at math, so I'm actually not too bad at it now, and really enjoyed it, and it gave me a three-dimensional view of the battlefield. But no, I'm an infantryman. I always have been. I mean. And that's one of the things I always tell people that talk to me about the military. I'm like, never let the military tell you what you're going to do. And while you may not, have the maturity and education to know all the aspects of the military, if you're gonna sign up and present that blank check to the military and to the nation, then you should at least do something that you want to do that's going to make you happy, because you're going to sacrifice a lot one way or the other. And so don't do some job that you don't want to do. I mean, you should at least have the job experience, or the pleasure of the atmosphere that you want to have. And so, I mean, I was an infantryman from day one, and so that was what I was called to do. And so I wasn't going to give up on that, and I wasn't going to let the Army tell me. And that was the last time that I let the Army. I didn't go to the Army and tell them what I was going to do, as opposed to them telling me. I always had set the deck beforehand. So it was a good lesson learned.
I think they're a lot better about that now. I know the Marine Corps used to you just signed up to be a Marine.
That's right.
And that was it. You were going to get whatever they gave you. The Marine Corps does a lot better with that now, but everybody, all the service branches do it better now, because they realize if you got a guy that actually wants to do the job you put him in, he's going to do a better job.
Yeah.
But yeah, you definitely have a lot more, you can, especially when you're first joining the Army or first joining the military, you don't think you have any say, but you actually do. You can make things happen. Yeah. So you end up reporting summer 1989. You go to the U.S. Army Artillery School in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. This is sort of the epicenter of artillery training. You get Marines out there as well. And you learn the art and the science and the physics and the ballistics of it all. And you end up learning about forward observers. So tell us a little bit about forward observers and what they do.
Yeah,
FOs.
FOs. So always interested in Rangers, and within the artillery, you can shoot the guns and do all that types of thing, or they have forward observers that go with the infantry. And so I wanted to be in the infantry, and I knew that was as close as I could get. So I focused on trying to be a forward observer, an artilleryman that would go up with the infantry units and then control the artillery and other fire support. So that's what I kind of gravitated toward. And then I would see that the Rangers did that even a little bit differently. Instead of somebody from an artillery unit, they would actually have these forward observers in the Ranger battalions, and so I knew that's really where I wanted to go.
And so you started volunteering for Ranger School.
I did, yeah. I 100% was going to do that. That was a good way to go back to the infantry, but went into the program they ran at Fort Sill, again, run by some Ranger Regiment guys, the program to get selected to go to Ranger School, and unfortunately I was.
So you get picked up for Ranger School. Fast forward a little bit in the book. After the Benning phase, those that remained moved to nearby Camp Darby, densely wooded with forests broken by creek bottoms and swamps. Camp Darby is located in a remote corner of Fort Benning. It was named after the hero of the Ranger Regiment and founder of the Rangers during World War II, Brigadier General William O. Darby. At Camp Darby, we began long foot patrols and constant cycle of Ranger missions that ran on for days, keeping us tired and hungry. We carried weapons, blank ammunition, heavy packs, and scant food through the waning heat of the days and into the cold nights of the Georgia November. The grueling patrols at Camp Darby preceded preceded by the first weeks of physical training, constituted the benning phase of Ranger School. Though the benning phase was primarily designed to cut the class size down by attrition, I made the grade on the first patrols at Camp Darby and successfully continued on to the next phases of Ranger School in the mountains of North Atlanta and the frigid swamps of Florida. Not only are Ranger students pushed physically through forest and mountain marches, but they are constantly on edge, being assessed and graded around the clock by their Rangers instructors. The RIs are veteran Rangers whose job it is to teach military skills and constantly monitor students for weakness or failure to maintain standards. During each phase of the course, Ranger students rotate through the jobs of leading patrols and raids, with each position carefully assessed and graded. A Ranger student must not only make it physically to the end of the phase, but must pass the RI's formal grading and assessment in order to proceed further on in the course. Additionally, the Ranger student must make the grade in the eyes of his fellow students. This test comes in the form of a peer evaluation survey, ranking each student in the group, with the bottom 10% being cut at the end of each phase. This becomes a lottery, with the pool growing smaller as time goes on, a reality that keeps the Ranger student constantly on edge. Do they cut the bottom? I thought it was like if somebody gets ranked at the bottom a bunch of times in a row, they get rid of them. I didn't know they just lopped off the bottom 10%.
Well, as I recall it, yeah, it was the bottom out of 10. The 10th guy would get he would either get a mark against him or he'd get moved to another platoon. And but again, it's stacking up against you, and everybody's accumulating different demerits or marks against them, and that's just another one, and that gets you moved out of your squad and can really set you back. So it's tough. And the other, of course, tough part about it, that is, in the first couple phases, I mean, you're getting rid of the guys that need to go, the dirt bags. So everybody that's left is pretty competent. And so now you got to go through the competent guys and cut the bottom. And, you know, but people aren't dumb. And so you start to rig things mathematically, and they take the best guy, rank him 10th. And so anyway, there's some things you can work around, but it's a lot of pressure, and you don't know. And it's you got to build coalitions, and it's an interesting dynamic to it. Peer evals are.
Yeah. From guys that I've talked to, basically they say like you're a good guy, I'm a good guy, okay, rank me last this time. That's right. We'll rank you next last time. Echo will and so that way none of us are getting cut. Right. But if we actually don't like someone, and they're a dirtbag, we can just put them at the bottom and they're gone. Yeah. Which is pretty. I think that's great. Yeah. Yeah. This how much weight did you lose going through Ranger School?
I lost. I mean, I didn't have a whole lot to lose going in, so I lost a good 20-some pounds. Yeah.
And what did you think of Ranger School compared to now? You've been through all these other courses. You know, you spent 4 years at the Citadel. You did 9 months of that plebe or knob situation. Yeah. You must be pretty freaking tough to annoy at this point. You pretty much take anything.
Yeah, I mean, good thing I was so young. I didn't know any better. You know, I kind of thought that's just what life was. So now that I know that's not the case, I'm not sure it'd been so easy. But actually, Ranger School was really a good culmination because I could put a lot of the mental challenges from the Citadel together with a lot of the physical challenges from infantry school. And, you know, again, it's at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they just give you a change to the mission, and you got to figure things out and get people moving, and everybody's asleep. That's when you got to really reach down, as you know, and motivate yourself and then motivate everybody else. And so it was a good almost culminating event to be able to put those skills together. So, because again, it's very physical and very mental all at the same time. Ranger School is.
Any major challenges while you were there? Did you make it through in one shot?
I did make it through in one shot, which is really fortunate, and most people don't. But that's not bragging, because I got dinged up along the way with quite a few demerits, and got saved a couple times by people. And so I think my strength was that I did well on patrols, and so you know, and I also learned kind of that ethos too. The more you help other people, the more you help yourself, you know, and that's a good thing. So I was in tune to that. So I did make it through, but I got quite a few demerits and write-ups, and so it was stress.
Now, you end up getting orders to the 2nd Infantry Division in South Korea.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back to one of the other points, the Army had told me, so I wanted to go to the lightest infantry unit that I could go to. Well, where does the Army want to send me? To a Lance Missile Battalion, which is like going to NASA. And I wasn't having any of that. So I used the Citadel network. I found a Citadel colonel. I said, hey, man, I want to go to a place with light infantry. And he said, we got this slot in Korea. So I took that. So that was the first learning, I'd learned my lesson there and set the conditions and told the Army where I was going to go. So that was good.
You were able to make that happen. You arrive in Korea. It's 1990, and that's kind of a good place to go at this time frame. Being on the DMZ is as good as it's going to get in 1990.
At that time, at that month, it was the hottest place to go. To face off with the North Korean Army because there was no wars going on at that time.
Of course, by August of 1990, in the book here you talk about it. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. Now you end up securing a spot in the 82nd Airborne because you were maneuvering. You seem to be doing some maneuvering to try to get to go to war.
Yeah, definitely. The Army came down and said, nobody's leaving Korea. You're going to stay stabilized there because of mission. But I wasn't having any of that. So as the Army was deploying off to Desert Storm, I was working the system. And again, I wasn't going to let anybody down. I was going to make sure that there was because I knew the Army would say one thing and then there was reality underneath. And in reality, they had more guys coming. My replacement was coming. And so why should me and my replacement both sit there? And so I was staying very in tune on that. I was up at 2 o'clock in the morning, calling back to D.C. and worked it so I got my way all the way down to a unit that was already deployed in Desert Storm. And then the Lord had other plans for me.
Yeah, the other plans was that you had screened for or applied to be to go to the Ranger Regiment.
That's right.
And sort of at the same time, you get both sets of orders offered to you. And you go in the book here, would I take the orders I had in hand to go to war with the 82nd Airborne or follow my original dream and join a Ranger Battalion? Convinced none of this was happening by chance and bolstered by my belief that there could not be a war without the Rangers, the Army's spearhead combat unit, I accepted the assignment to join 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. So your thought was, well, 82nd Airborne is, they're already there, but if I'm going to Ranger Battalion, of course I'm going to war.
That's right.
And you were wrong.
I was wrong.
The war was over a little too quick for that.
And 3rd Battalion had been lined up for a special operation to secure the U.S. Embassy and some hostages. And when Saddam Hussein let those people go, then 3rd Battalion came off that hook, but the other battalions were already lined up to go, and so we did not go.
Fast forward a little bit in the book. You say, we spent the next few months watching the returning soldiers of the regular army strut around Fort Benning, brashly pointing at their combat laurels and asking us, where were you? We knew this was a one-off for the regular army and that at some point that the 9/11 call would come in again and the fire bell would ring for us. Meanwhile, the Rangers returned to cycle of week in, week out training like we were going to the Super Bowl. So that had to sting.
Oh, that stung bad. It still stings. It still stings. But I had a great story though. And St. Patrick's Day, Savannah, Georgia. It's a huge event. The population of the city doubles. And 1st Ranger Battalion's in Savannah, so I was in 3rd. So I went down there to watch the parade. And 1st Ranger Battalion always has a company march in the parade. Well, in that parade, all the Desert Storm guys were there, and they literally were running around and had their hats on sideways, and really kind of clowning it up, but just jubilant that they were home. So good on them. But then after the clown show kind of passes by, the crowd just hushed, and you could hear marching. And here comes a company from 1st Battalion with bayonets marching by. Just looking fantastic. And somebody in the crowd said, "Here come the real fighters." And so that kind of pumped me back up a little bit again too. It was really cool to hear that.
Now, before you got here today, I was telling Echo Charles that life of a Ranger, the day-to-day life of a Ranger, is about as Spartan as you can find in the U.S. military. Talk to us a little bit. So you're now at Ranger Battalion. What's that like? What's day-to-day life like?
Yeah, for the whole battalion, for the whole unit, it's 100% focused on the mission. Getting ready for training, but that training is focused on being ready to go. You're on an 18-hour notice, that's a rotation, kind of like firemen in a firehouse waiting for the bell to ring. So the battalions rotate that responsibility, but they have a responsibility to be able to respond in 18 hours. So that's really an incredible timeline to have to meet. When I say respond, that means in an aircraft, wheels up, going downrange to a mission. And so you literally have to be 30 minutes response to get to your unit and get your stuff and go. and that rotates. But that's a big part of your life, and so you really have to be 100% dedicated to it. There's no, I don't feel good today. There's no, hey, my kid's birthday is today, so I can't come. There's none of that. And the Ranger Battalion has to be like, the rest of the Army is not like that.
No. The rest of the military is not like that.
That's right. So
that's why most Rangers don't stay in for a long period of time. And when you meet a guy that's been in like I've met guys that were in Rangers for 22 years and they're just like hard. They're a different type of human right there because they've been living the same way like a Spartan for 20 years.
Oh yeah, and that's a great point because I'll meet somebody that say, "Well, I did 4 years in the Army or 4 years in the Air Force." I'm like, "Good on you," but that's not that huge a thing. But if I meet somebody that said they were in battalion, I don't care if they were in there for 3 years or 30 years. I mean, you were in battalion, and so that's a different lifestyle. And I would say again, I was a lieutenant. So, I had to meet all those standards and I had to conform to that. But again, I was treated more of a gentleman, we would say. But the privates, the young guys that are there, it's just like the guys at the Citadel, except they are getting smoked physically around the clock, and they've got to be completely dedicated to it. So you're right, 100%. It's probably the most Spartan lifestyle. And that goes on for them similarly for a year until they go to Ranger School. And when they graduate Ranger School and come back with a tab, then they start getting treated more like a human. But it was a year of that for those guys. My hat is off to young guys raised in battalion.
Yeah, no doubt. And then I'm going to fast forward a little bit. In 1992, Colonel Dave Grange Jr. took over as commander of the 75th Ranger Regiment, and a fast-paced training cycle became even more intense. Colonel Grange was the son of one of the Army's legendary generals. Colonel Grange's father, Lieutenant General Dave Grange Sr., was an infantry officer and 3-war U.S. Army veteran who cast a long shadow. His son, Dave Grange Jr., was intensely competitive and strove to equal, if not outdo, his father's legacy. By 1992, he was well on his way, having served as a recon platoon leader with the 82nd Airborne in Vietnam, then becoming a Special Forces officer, and later an Army helicopter pilot. Dave Grange Jr. had a career path not even possible in today's Army, one that represents quite an accomplishment. As a captain, Dave Grange Jr. commanded the company from the 1st Ranger Battalion that had gone into Iran in 1980 as part of Operation Eagle Claw. He next tried out for the Army's elite and secretive Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta and was selected to serve as one of its senior officers. An experienced veteran, Ironman triathlete, and inspiring leader, there were few men who could equal Colonel Grange's reputation or drive. As the 75th Ranger Regiment commander, Colonel Grange made it clear that chief among his priorities was to get the Ranger battalions into action and take on America's enemies. So he just comes in, steps it up even more.
It was incredible. You want to turn a freight train into a bullet train. That's what happened. And at least in the tempo that we had is you would go to the field, you come back, and then you might have what we would call a little downtime, like maybe going to the range and doing some training and things, but none of that even compared to when Grange came in. And so, I mean, we literally were loading aircraft, flying to Europe, flying to Korea, flying to South America, and coming back and cleaning gear and then loading the next aircraft and going again. It was just an unbelievable pace.
And by the way, when you say you got in an aircraft and flew somewhere, you jumped. You guys were just jumping in everywhere.
Yeah, that was not a commercial flight. That was getting into a C-141. And I love the C-17 today, but again, it's nothing compared to the 141 as far as comfort. The C-141, as you well know, was just a metal tube with a net, and we would pack guys in so tight. I mean, you were literally compressed, and you had your gear all stacked on you, and then you'd. At some point, hours and hours and hours into that flight, you would have to make enough room to wiggle into your parachute, strap it on, and then hook up and parachute out. It was just an unbelievable experience. Unbelievable.
No doubt about it. You guys are pushing real hard, and you say this in the book. Invariably, during intense realistic training, there are accidents. In the swirling dust of Nevada that fall, B Company lost Ranger Sergeant Jeffrey Palmer, who was accidentally shot when he crossed into the fire of other Rangers. So you guys are pushing hard, live fire. There's another training mission you talk about, the Great Salt Lake. The trail aircraft of this formation was a U.S. Air Force Special Operations helicopter containing a number of key leaders, to include the U.S. Air Force Squadron Commander and the commander of the 1st Ranger Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Ken Stouse. With Stouse in the helicopter was my commander from 3rd Ranger Battalion, John Keneally. Am I saying that right?
That's right, John Keneally.
John Keneally, there to observe and provide feedback, bringing up the rear of the tight formation, flying under night vision goggles. The U.S. Air Force pilots could not discern the causeway and struck it at over 100 miles an hour, causing the aircraft to crash into the lake, killing most of the U.S. servicemen on board. Miraculously, one of the U.S. Air Force pilots survived the crash, floating in the lake until he was rescued by legendary Ranger medic Doc Donovan. Donovan had been monitoring the exercise at a nearby Air Force base, waiting for the live fire to begin, but upon learning of the crash, he rushed to the water's edge. Seeing the burning aircraft about a mile out, he commandeered a tiny rubber boat and paddled through the darkness and frigid waters to the wreck in time to save the struggling pilot. Lieutenant Colonel John Keneally had not only been a commander but a mentor to many of the junior officers, and his loss was a hard one. These were not the only losses suffered in training by the Ranger Regiment that year. More Rangers were killed that year during intense training than most units lost in combat during Desert Storm. Yeah, pushing the envelope on that training.
Yeah, I think that says it all, and we were as careful and all that as we could be, but, paramount above safety, and we were going to be practical and safe, right? But paramount above safety was we were going to be able to accomplish the task that we had to do in combat as realistically as possible. So there wasn't any, well, it's too dangerous to. If we had to do it in combat, we were gonna rehearse it, and unfortunately, tragically, you lose guys, and so that's what happened.
Yeah, there's definitely a very fine line to walk when you're in charge of training, and because you have to push hard. You have to make sure that the guys are ready to execute in combat. And when you're shooting live fire, you're flying out of helicopters, you're fast roping, you're parachuting, you're diving, like everything that you're doing, there's risk in every single one of those things. And you have to take some level of risk to train properly and be ready. Otherwise, you're going to go on the battlefield and you're not going to be effective.
That's right.
By the way, again, this information's get the book. You met a woman during the June block leave in 1993. Beth and I were married at 1,600 hours, and another Ranger officer friend of mine, Captain Jim Klingeman, married his bride Kathy at 1,800 hours. It's pretty funny. So you guys would go on block leave,
right?
And everyone needs to go line up and get married.
That's exactly how it was. Yep. Because we all went on leave at the same 2 weeks together, and so that calendar is filled up. You just had to get your time slot at the chapel and got married. So yeah, again, because I was an officer, I got a little more downtime than the average Ranger, and so when I had time, I'd go out in town. Met Beth; she was a local there in Columbus, Georgia, and about 6 months later, we got married.
Again, so much stuff, great information in here, but I'm going to fast forward a little bit. The U.S.-led United Nations mission to feed starving refugees in the chaotic, failed state of Somalia had begun with the initial invasion by U.S. troops in December 1992 under the orders of President George H.W. Bush. The mission had achieved initial success, securing the key cities of Kismayo and Baido and the capital Mogadishu. Once U.S. troops had become established on the ground, the rival Somali militias faded in the background, and the stage was set for the UN to provide humanitarian aid to the starving refugees. In addition to the food and relief supplies, the U.S.-led coalition was able to bring relative stability to some of the major Somali cities. By early February, the initial mission with its objectives of humanitarian relief had been achieved, but by this time, President Bush had left office. Under his successor, Bill Clinton, the mission soon began to change. Pressed by the UN Secretary General for aggressive disarmament of the Somali militias and emboldened by early successes and relative ease of securing the country, Clinton began to gradually implement a plan for nation building to attempt to reestablish a modern civil society in Somalia. How much attention were you paying to that?
Just a little bit, because again, we were training, flying, going to all these different countries. But at the same time, we were always looking to see is there anything that we can get in, anything that we can that may pop up for us. And so Kind of similar to Desert Storm, we watched units roll out to Somalia to go do this peacekeeping thing, this humanitarian relief thing, engineer units and all that. And we were kind of hoping, and then, months and months went by and nothing happened. And so it kind of faded into the background, but so not as much. That's why we got caught a little bit by surprise.
It's interesting. I've had guys in here that were in the Naval Academy or at West Point in like 1965, 1966. They didn't even know anything about Vietnam. Like, it was just so off the radar for guys until, I guess it was like 1965, Battle of Ai Valley, but that's where it really started to hit the news.
Right.
But people weren't even thinking about it.
Yeah.
They weren't even thinking about it. So, yeah, the chance of being thinking about Somalia.
Yeah.
However, summer 1993, over in Somalia, 2 American Humvees had been ambushed and 4 U.S. troops had been killed. Today, that news would barely make the headlines, but in 1993, after decades of relative peace, this was a major event that rippled through the nation. As we sat in our tents and absorbed that news, our company commander came in looking crestfallen. A special operations task force was being formed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to deal with the deteriorating situation in Somalia, and 3rd Battalion had been ordered to send 1 Ranger company to join that task force. Our neighbors in Bravo Company had been selected for the mission. That news hit us in Alpha Company with shock and wave of disappointment, but I barely had time to absorb it as a runner arrived with a message from the battalion headquarters. I was being urgently called to report to the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel McKnight. Not having time to think about what was going on, I hurried off to the battalion headquarters tent. This is a real hard thing for people to understand, for civilians to understand, that a call comes in that one company from the battalion is going to war and you're not in that company, and just how pissed you're going to be.
Oh, yeah. And again, it's the difference between a Ranger special ops unit and the regular military. I mean, that's why we're there. We're there waiting for that. And that's a really interesting passage. And again, if you couple that to a couple other things that happened in my life, such as Korea, getting diverted to the Ranger Battalion from the 82nd at the absolute last second. And in this, it's beyond, as I talk about, it's beyond just coincidence. It's beyond just planets coming into alignment, because my, as we're going to talk about, my counterpart in B Company had just departed 4 hours before to go home on emergency leave. And so that window of opportunity is so small, it's beyond coincidence.
Yeah, so there you go. You get called into the battalion commander. Lieutenant Colonel Danny McKnight greeted me cordially, but with an air of seriousness. When I arrived at his tent, as I knocked and walked in, he asked me, "Are you ready?" When I immediately gave him the standard Ranger answer, "Hua, sir," he quickly got to the point. McKnight informed me that the lieutenant, who was my fire support counterpart in Bravo Company, had departed Fort Bliss just hours before and gone home for a family emergency. Bravo Company would be departing to join the task force now assembling at Fort Bragg in a few hours. The battalion commander then informed me that I would be his replacement. So there you go. Fast forward a little bit. The tension and excitement. So now you're going to go get with Bravo Company. The tension and excitement in Bravo Company were palpable as preparations for departure were underway. I checked in with the company commander, Captain Mike Steele, and his first sergeant, Glenn Harris. Captain Steele was a hulking former college football player. He had been a starting lineman at offensive tackle for the University of Georgia when Herschel Walker received the Heisman Trophy, and they had won the college national championship in the 1981 Sugar Bowl. I had only dealt with Mike Steele a couple of times back at Fort Benning, where he had been on the battalion staff before he took over command of Bravo Company. He had a reputation for being gruff and stubborn, but also for being a completely dedicated Ranger. So you knew him.
I did, yeah. Again, from staff work, yeah. So I went over to meet the company commander. I'm going to be his right hand man for fire support. Meet the first sergeant, try to integrate into the company. It was all happening very fast.
And like you said, it's happening fast. Next thing, you guys are on a C-141. You're heading to the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, and you are going to go and integrate with Delta.
That's right, yeah. So I'd moved from A Company, and we were on a deployment on an exercise, and so in the middle of that exercise, move over to B Company, literally pick up my gear, my pack, and go over and get in the line and get on the plane, and then we fly into Fort Bragg and start linking up with Delta at Bragg. And
then how's that? You talk about the integration with Delta as you guys show up there. So, I mean, let me give a little precursor.
Sure.
A Delta guy has been in for a long time.
Right.
They get obviously the best training in the world. They're highly selected, and they're, just straight up older. And so Rangers, like we were talking about, these kids can be 18 years. You can be in a Ranger Battalion and be 18 years old.
That's right.
And there's a lot of Rangers that are 18, 19, 20 years old.
That's right.
Young. A lot of them are on their first enlistment. Maybe they've been in the Army for 2, 3, 4 years. At least the frontline Rangers. Every Delta guy's been in the Army for 10 years or a much longer period of time.
Right.
So immediately there's a little bit of just a discrepancy on that. You just got two different cultures. The other big cultural difference is Rangers are freaking, as we talked about, just Spartan troopers.
Right.
And Delta, they're professionals, and they have more training, more experience, and they have more liberty with how they operate.
Sure.
So that's to kind of set up what you're walking into.
Sure.
Is that accurate?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 100% accurate. And I would also agree with the point and emphasize maturity. So that there's a lot of maturity there with Delta. And then there was also more of a hierarchical thing, and it's a literal and a figurative hierarchy. In those days, even the Rangers who are going to fight alongside, well, we don't talk about Delta. You can't even discuss Delta. It's so secret and so, kind of black that you can't even talk about it. And so we were trying to discuss amongst ourselves, and what do you think the mission is? I mean, how are they going to, we're trying to figure things out. We weren't even supposed to discuss it. And so that's kind of so almost like an oppressive heat, it was such a black thing that we couldn't even discuss it. And I can see in retrospect now, I mean, that's a very difficult, professionally, that's a very difficult way to integrate into a team if you're that in the dark, literally, about how somebody works, what they want you to do, and then we show up and we're trying to integrate. Yeah,
and then like right out of the gate, again, they're treating you guys like, okay, this is what we're gonna do. Here's how we're gonna hit the target. And you're like, what target?
Yeah.
Like you guys literally did not have any information, and it's a rough kind of out of the gate integration, I would say.
Yeah, very, very much so, and it's a really interesting study in the dynamics of organizations. So we knew that there had been a mission being considered for Somalia, a special operations mission for a couple months now. We were basically aware of that. We hadn't been briefed on it, but we knew that they were looking at some sort of special operations mission. And obviously Delta was specifically aware of it, and they were read onto it, and they were training for it, and they were making their plan. But we, as B Company 375, had not been briefed on that plan at all. And again, there was this culture of, well, you can't even say the word Delta. You can't even discuss that. So when we show up on the range at Fort Bragg, they didn't know that. They thought, that we'd been briefed and we were planning already and ready to go. And so they're like, well, we're going to live fire right now. We're like, we don't even know what we're live firing. We don't even know what the mission is. So just some organizational frictions right out of the gate, difficulties to overcome. And so we dug into it and started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just the combat experience.
Yeah.
And lack of combat experience, because no one had. I mean, I don't know what percentage of Delta guys on this operation had like a ton of combat experience. I doubt it was a lot. Sure, they might have had some lingering. It's 1993. Vietnam ended in 1971, 72, 73. There was a couple people still there, but a lot of those guys were either very, very senior, or they'd retired or gotten out or whatever. So, in the SEAL teams, we had very few Vietnam guys left when I got there in 1990. And so having guys with combat experience, and we had guys that had been in Desert Storm.
Right.
And back then, we would look at it like they had combat experience. Me now, I look at it like it's a different thing. It's a different level of combat experience. Right. It's like someone that had been in a street fight versus someone that was a professional MMA fighter. Yeah. Like the street fighter, the guy's been in a street fight. Okay, cool. One time. Right. Versus someone that trains every day, and that's what we end up getting for combat experience in the global war on terror. So again, I think there's a lot of things that you learn in war that probably were not front of mind at this time with anybody in the military.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And it's as you said, as we've deployed now for decades, there's just trends and things about combat that we know intuitively that we just didn't know back then. And so I think the number one thing is you can't ever make an assumption. You can't make an assumption that somebody's going to know something or understand something. Getting everybody on the same page is really, really key.
Yeah. Yeah. So you go through this, and you guys go through a spin up and a stand down and a spin up and a stand down, and just echo Charles. You might not know what spin up. Spin up is like, we're launching now. Yeah. Stand down is like, all right, no, we're not going. Spin up is, oh no, we're launching. And this happens a lot. And it definitely happened in the 90s a lot. And you go through that a bunch of, and again, it's really great to your debriefs and hear about this integration and the challenges and the rehearsals and how you guys finally get kind of unified about what you're doing. And meanwhile, this whole thing is spin up, stand down, spin up, stand down. And you guys actually get stood down to the point where they go, okay, this is not happening. And they put you all on aircraft and send you back to Texas.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
This is not happening.
Yeah, we did all that training for a couple weeks and got briefed on the plan, made our plan, and then live fired it and did it over and over and over again. I mean, once the training train got going, it was very good. Mm-hmm. We rehearsed it from all angles, and then all of a sudden, the commander brought us in and said, "Okay, it's scratched," and that's kind of a fairly normal thing, not out of the ordinary in special operations. So we got back on birds and flew back to Texas.
You guys get back there. You say, as I walked in the Alpha Company area and began to settle in, providing short answers to all inquiries, just as we had been directed. But before we could unpack our rucks in what was now becoming a pattern in this drama, a messenger arrived from battalion headquarters. A new order had come from Washington. We were to immediately rejoin B Company. The mission was a go. But there were also more changes. The additional Rangers from 1st Platoon Alpha Company had been cut by officials in Washington, saying quick goodbyes to a disappointed 1st Platoon and my FO, Sergeant Lechner. We headed back to join B Company. Within hours, we were again reloading the waiting U.S. Air Force transport aircraft and were soon flying back across country to Fort Bragg. So there's a couple things that I mentioned there, which I hadn't mentioned yet, but there was actually an additional Ranger platoon that had been added on, so they were going to have a little bit of a bigger force.
Right.
That means you'd have just more ground combat power.
More combat power, yep.
And that got cut, and there's some other things that get cut, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. Fast forward a little bit, I had not completely digested the shock and excitement of the last few days with all the dramatic ups and downs. Just over 2 months ago, I'd been single. Now I was married with a baby on the way, and instead of heading to a classroom at Fort Benning, Georgia, I was with B Company and Task Force Ranger about to embark on the odyssey of my life. Fast forward, the next day, the entire task force was broken down into groups of deployment chalks, then moved to the airfield aboard buses driven by support personnel from Delta. Fast forward, almost immediately after the C-5 took off, one of the engines had a mechanical failure. So now you guys have to land, you have to get a delay, and you end up being the last aircraft. And fast forward, finally near the end of August, the huge transport touched down on the worn runway and into the reality of Mogadishu. So you finally show up there.
Yeah, the good news was, even though we got jerked around a lot, once we got back to Texas and got off the plane, but they immediately told us you're going, the train didn't stop then. I mean, once we got back on the birds and flew to Bragg, we were only at Bragg for like 24 hours. Mm-hmm. And it was all the standard stuff of get your last minute shots, write your last letter, hand that to the chaplain, and then get on the C-5 and go. So that train moved pretty quickly, and that was good. That was the good part.
Yeah, and it's wild too. Again, thinking about the war on terror op tempo, like, here we are talking about the word coming from Washington. Like, this was just day-to-day life, during the war on terror. That's what was happening. And it's funny too, because when I was a young SEAL in the 90s, everything was about training for what we called the big mish, one mission. Right. Like, we would hope and pray to be able to get one mission.
One mission.
The big mish, we called it. Which was actually a mindset that we had to change, because we realized, once the war started, it's not one mission.
That's right.
It's going to be night after night after night after night. That's what we're doing.
It's a marathon. Yeah.
By August 26th, the entire task force had arrived in Mogadishu. In the talk, we soon met Major General Bill Garrison, who was the commander of Joint Special Operations Command, it would now command the overall effort of Task Force Ranger. The same leaders who assembled with us at Fort Bragg: Lieutenant Colonel McKnight, the 3rd Ranger Battalion commander; Lieutenant Colonel Harrell, the C Squadron commander; and Colonel Boykin, commanding Delta. Each had his role to play and would assist Major General Garrison, but the overall responsibility of command was his. You give a good description. Tall Texan. He was a guy who was in Vietnam. He was in the Phoenix program. He helped found Delta under Colonel Beckworth. And then you talk a little bit about some of the other kind of ad hoc things that were going on. Our primary intelligence collection platform was a U.S. Navy P-3 Orion anti-submarine warfare plane. So this is some of the integration issues that we have. Is like all of a sudden we got this random... No, again... Of course, the U.S. Navy P-3 Orion, anti-submarine warfare, they're awesome at anti-submarine warfare.
That's right.
And that's their perspective. That's what they're looking for, and we're asking them to do something different.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the reasons I wrote the book, and it's not to be the critic, but to show how things were back then, because they're a lot different than they are today. And the good news story, and we'll talk about this, the good news story is the U.S. military has used this and really, especially JSOC, and really evolved the capability, really gone back and looking what we did wrong and really fixed things. And so, one of the aspects of it was really a pickup team. Mm-hmm. And even though we did a lot of training and we thought we were integrated, we weren't integrated at all. And so really we didn't integrate with Delta. The Ranger Company didn't integrate with Delta until we showed up at Fort Bragg that first time. And so just a couple weeks before. And now you start going to the task force level and building that task force capability, and it was really a pickup team. Guys that had never worked together before, and to the extreme point of bringing very professional air crew in from that P-3 Orion, but nowhere in their training had they ever dreamed they were going to be hunting some Somali general through the streets. They were looking for Russian submarines. So almost a bizarre aspect to the task force. But again, I don't mind criticizing it and bringing those warts out, because JSOC's really learned and really built an incredible capability based on a lot of these shortcomings.
Mm-hmm. Fast forward a little bit, you guys get mortared. One TF soldier gets wounded. The actual TOC gets a round on the roof. And you write, as a fire supporter, part of me was perversely thrilled to be mortared for the first time. But I tried to respond coolly and professionally.
That's right. Yeah, right. Again, I was only still in my 20s, but this had been I'd focused on since I was, since DNA basically. And so it was the whole thing was just fantastic to be there. And everybody's only fear, instead of getting killed, our fear was we were going to get cut and sent home. Yep. So it was the whole thing was just like a once in a lifetime thing.
Yeah, and you have the feeling of like we're so good, and we're so awesome, and we have such great firepower, and we train so much, and we'll just this is going to be, for lack of a better word, it's going to be easy for us. We're going to go and high five, and we'll knock out these operations, and it'll be no factor.
Yeah, that's a great point. We talk about it a little bit in the book, but your day-to-day experience or executing these operations is so much confidence. It's so much of a feeling of, like you just said, hey, we're with Delta, and they're the best in the world, and we just won this big war against Iraq. I mean, crushed them, and we've got more firepower and technology, and so it actually took a lot of effort to be a professional and sit back and say, now hold on, the enemy gets a vote. Mm-hmm. And so what happens if we get in this bad situation? And you actually had people like, oh, why are you thinking about that? Mm-hmm. Why do you think about getting ambushed? Or why are you thinking about if, we're not going to be surrounded. We're not going to get an aircraft shot down. You had people like pushing back on that. So it took a lot of professional effort to really go through contingencies and overcome that hubris, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's one of my main complaints about politicians is they think that they think everything you just said, like of this war that we're about to start is going to go exactly how we plan. And that's what's going to happen.
Right.
And when we get bogged down and you fast forward, it's been 2 decades of war. Like no one thought of this. No one thought that we might get bogged down. It's totally ridiculous. And yet that stuff happens. And that attitude of like, sort of, hey, what are you worried about? You know,
Right,
when you come to me and
right.
say, well, hey, what if one of our aircraft goes down? And I go, hey, quit being a wimp.
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about? What are you scared?
Yeah.
Like that thing,
Right.
you know, no one wants to be called a coward. And when you say, hey, what about a contingency for a vehicle getting blown up? What are you worried about? We'll tow it out, no factor. Okay, well, if one vehicle gets blown up, couldn't two vehicles get blown up? And then where are we?
Yeah.
Like having the wherewithal to ask those questions of like, no, hold on, this doesn't make sense. And there's definitely stories that I've heard where no one in the room, people in the room had the thought,
Yeah.
but they didn't want to raise their hand and be the coward to say, well, hey, hold on a second, why are we doing this? Or wait a second, what if this happens? So yeah, like you said, it takes a whole nother level of professionalism, especially in the 90s. It'd be hard for a guy that grew up in the, you know, guy that joined in 2002 that just spent, you know, his whole career at war. It'd be hard for them to reverse their mindset into like that 90s mentality. Or for me, it was the 90s mentality. You guys get mortared and you immediately, like you say, the TF began a knee-jerk reaction. They'd send a platoon of Rangers out on patrol. They don't run into anything. And then there's some intel comes in and that we're going to go launch a mission against the Haber-Gitter. Am I saying that right?
Yes.
Haber-Gitter, which is like a clan
Right.
type group. And then the SNA, which is the Somali National Alliance. You guys are going to go out and do a hit. You had some intel. You get these coordinates. There's a guy draws up the sketch of what you're going to go do, and then boom, you go out and you go load up your aircraft. And again, I'm kind of fast forwarding through some of this stuff. Super 64, that's your bird you're going to be on.
Bird, yeah.
And fast forward a little bit. This would be the first real world mission for many of us. Fortunately, it passed with few hitches. By the time we sorted out the Ranger blocking positions in the dark, the Delta operators were well into the clearance of the buildings. The Rangers established the perimeter, and we caught glimpses in the dark of the Delta operators moving around the target building. They soon emerged with a handful of prisoners blindfolded and with their hands tied with thin plastic flex cuffs. The Somalis timidly knelt against a wall guarded by Delta operators as the clearing teams began to come out of the target building. After about 30 minutes on the ground, Delta had the building completely cleared, the Somali prisoners secured, and were prepared to move. The decision was then made to extract the entire force on helicopters, which would land in a small adjacent courtyard. Fast forward a little bit. After a short flight back, we landed in the still dark airfield. Streaming off the aircraft, the key leaders broke off and quickly moved toward the TOC to conduct our post-mission hot wash brief, while the rest of the operators and Rangers headed to the hangar. Our Somali prisoners had been lifted out before the assault force immediately flown to the airfield. They had been processed and moved to a small razor wire enclosure adjacent to the hangar. The mood in the TOC was calm and almost anticlimactic. The UN headquarters had responded to the raid with a surprising report that identified our prisoners as UN workers and that what we had hit was their office.
Yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So yeah, a couple of things there. Obviously, our mission was to go over there and try to neutralize the leadership of the Somalis that were pushing back on the UN effort. And it wasn't all the Somalis. It was actually only one tribe out of 5, and that was led by Mohamed Farah Aideed. So that tribe was the Haber-Gitter. So you're talking over 500,000 people in that tribe in Mogadishu. And their political and military group was the Somali National Alliance, and Aideed was the head of it. So the mission, go in and capture him, and the national level leadership thought that if they did that, then that would collapse the resistance. I mean, we knew that wasn't the case, but again, we weren't going to argue. We just wanted to go. But the interesting thing about this too, again, from a 90s perspective is, and all special operators now I think are so used to going in and everything's so developed. You got your intel systems in place and you got your targets developed and you go in and start picking and choosing and hitting things. Well, that wasn't the case here. I mean, we started from like not even a cold start. And we basically had to take the intelligence lists from the regular UN and regular U.S. Army units that were there and say, well, where do you guys think the enemy's at? And they gave us this list, and this is in the first couple days on the ground before we got our systems in place and we learned how to do it. Because there was a lot of learning going on back then on how to do this targeting. And so basically they gave us this list. The top place was this Ligligado compound, and we hit that only to find out that it was owned by the Somali National Alliance, and they would rent it out to the UN during the day. So, just kind of a crazy situation, and trying to sort our way through that. But again, I look at today versus then. I mean, we just did not have an intelligence system in place, and we were trying to get it in place and learn how to do it, which would be very foreign to, I think, anybody in special operations would go somewhere today.
Yeah, I always tell a story about my first deployment to Iraq. I was in Baghdad, and we went out, and we had the mission tasking come, and I get the map, and there's a satellite imagery shot, and there's a red X on the building, like this is what we're going to hit, and I'm like, cool. We go hit the building, and we hit the building, and we don't, it's like a totally normal person's house, but we start talking to those people, and they go, oh, we know what you're looking for. Go 2 doors down. And so we hit building 2 doors down. We find IED making material and all that. But I come back from that operation, and I said to myself, and I said to my intel guys, I'm like, who put this red X here? Who put this red X on this building? And they're like, well, we got it from them. And I go, okay. So I just followed that chain until I found the guy. And it was like a E4 intel guy that had been told to put together the thing, and he pulled the, through various sources. But when he told me how he put the red X on that building, it was very obvious that it wasn't corroborated properly, and he could have easily corroborated it, but he didn't. He just was like, he had to get it done, and hey, the thing's due, and so he put the red X, and boom, sent it up the chain, and boom, here I was, an idiot, went, cool, bad guys, we'll go get them. And so that's a lesson that I learned, and I never made that mistake again. Not that we never hit the wrong target building, because sometimes things would happen, but for the most part, I knew the reason. I knew who put the red X on a building. Yeah. And this is a very important thing, but that wasn't passed to me. Like that's not a lesson that got passed down. I tried and pass it on. Hopefully someone listening to this podcast right now goes, that makes sense. But what happens when it's the 90s and you get tasked with hitting a target, bro, you don't care where that target came from.
That's right.
I wouldn't have.
But that's a great point too. Like you said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So even with our really robust systems in place, just like you, we've all got stories like that. Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And it just, again, I carried that with me all my career, is verify where this came from, figure out what why they said this should be the target, pull that string, because the more you pull that string, and it's on you as a commander to do it. Yeah. When I was that young, I didn't know that you had to go verify and kind of check other people's work. But if you're the guy kicking the door, you got to check everybody's work.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Fast forward a little bit. You say, while the media gleefully described our first raid as a, quote, bungled operation, and the UN expressed their displeasure, Major General Garrison took a patient step back and exercised mature discretion. The task force had reacted in part to Aideed's goading with the mortars and probes and had failed to immediately grasp the subtleties of tracking him in the city. We quickly realized that on this type of operation, there would be no looming forts to assault or flags to capture. Only careful study of patterns and vulnerabilities while waiting on opportunities for a quick strike would lead to success. This would be accomplished by continuing to weave our intelligence net, casting it throughout the city, and building a picture of where to find Aideed day after day, week after week. Fast forward a little bit. September 6th, we received a promising lead. As usual, the birds with the Delta assault teams landed first, followed closely by Ranger Blackhawks, and landing. Delta operators cleared the building. And again, get the book so you can get the details of this stuff. Somalis began to react. They come looking, and now you get kind of your first contacts, RPGs, some heavy automatic weapons. Fast forward a little bit. The Ranger platoon's response was violent and overwhelming, with 50 caliber machine guns and Mark 19 grenade launchers shredding the Somali position. The short, almost one-sided exchanges had been the first real contact for the Rangers. One of the Rangers in the convoy, Specialist Joe Harowski, received a light wound to the leg. Sergeant Mike Pringle, standing in the turret of a battalion commander's Humvee, had his helmet spun around by a machine gun bullet. Later intelligence confirmed Aideed had been there, but avoided capture. So, you guys getting your first contact.
Yep, we're closing in. Yep, starting to put some pressure on.
And the weird thing about contact like that is, for most people, it doesn't make you feel more vulnerable. It makes you feel less vulnerable.
Right.
Like, oh, look what we did.
Right.
They took their best shot, and we were able to come out on top. What was the op tempo? Just talk about, because I'm kind of skipping or I'm fast forwarding.
Right.
But what was the op tempo like?
Yeah, so is an continuous flow of intelligence coming in. As we developed our system better and our network out there, we're getting all kinds of reports, and some of them would start to get traction. Like, there might be a meeting here today. He might be at this house tonight. We might know where he's going to drive, this afternoon. And so that was continually starting to mature. And as a mission would start to crystallize, they'd start to say, okay, it's looking better and better that he's going to come to this meeting. And the task force would start to strap up, get everything on, move towards the aircraft, and then waiting on, what we call the triggers now, on something to launch the mission. For sure he's going to be there and the conditions are set, we can go in. But there's a continuous process of, you're in the TOC, you're watching the intel, you're making a plan, okay, that's not going to work. Oh, now here's another report. And we'll start doing the same thing on that. And these would get to different levels of maturity. And then sometimes we would actually launch. So continuous kind of roller coaster of stand up, stand down, stand up, stand down, and having to watch the intel. It's very fluid. And so, again, one of the things we talked about, and it takes a lot of patience. And it would be very easy to just say, hey, let's go breach that place and go in guns blazing just to expend some energy, but it takes a lot of patience to let things develop. And that's another thing that I learned. General Garrison, as you mentioned, very good at that, very good at being patient. He had plenty of combat under his belt, so he didn't have anything to prove. But we were all just like, why don't we just go strike this target? We can see something there. Well, it was a patience game, and that's what the op tempo was like. In addition to that, we learned that since we were a helicopter-borne assault force, and so when the helicopter force would take off out of the airfield, everybody knew something was going on. So in order to reduce that signature, they'd have us fly no matter what 2 or 3 times a day, and so that was a blast. I mean, it was a roller coaster ride, flying rooftop level around that city 2 or 3 times a day, sitting on the side of Black Hawks with the best pilots. But it kept us busy. And
only because I think I kind of skipped by this. Your job. Describe your job. So you're kind of in charge of this team of forward observers who are attached with each one of the Ranger chalks that are out there.
Right. So my job still associated with the artillery, and so specifically, I had forward observers, with each of the Ranger elements, and their job was to control fires. Normally, that would come from like an AC-130 or a helicopter gunship or from mortars. In this case, we had 2 Black Hawks with snipers on board. And again, this is the kindler, gentler, trying to take a reduced approach to things. So they had snipers on board. And then in reserve, we had 4 attack helicopters with rockets and Gatling guns. And going back to some of our previous discussions, I had to go through and I had to kind of fight with the chain of command to get them to put rockets on the helicopters. They say, oh, you're not going to need that. Those Gatling guns are plenty. I kind of had to fight with them almost on a mission-by-mission basis, as we're going to talk about, to get them to put rockets on. But that's basically the package that we had. We would have snipers, and so my forward observers would see a threat, and they would call that in to the snipers on board the Black Hawks, and they would fly over with the snipers and try to engage that threat on the ground. So that was their job as forward observers. As a lieutenant, I was with the company commander. I controlled all those guys with each of the positions, and then I try to make sure we deconflicted and gave assets where they needed to be given.
And at this point, it sounds like you guys had a fairly solid sort of standard package that you were going to do, which looked like, correct me if I'm wrong, Rangers are going to go in and isolate the target building basically in 4 different corners of the building or the target area. And then Delta would come in, hit the target, get it cleared, and then you'd either collapse into the building and get extracted via helicopter or extract via the ground force.
Yeah, and that is essentially what the template was, with Rangers as a security element on the outside and then Delta hitting the target on the inside. One of the things that we did, and Delta made this decision, because of potentially we'd be doing it in daylight and the potential threat on the ground, they didn't want they wanted the initial surprise to be on their side. So they would go in first. So the assault element would go in on the target, on whatever building we were assaulting. they would assault that first. So Little Bird helicopters and Black Hawks Delta would go in and hit that target. And then as they were doing that, the Rangers were fast roping in all around them, establishing a security perimeter. That's one of the reasons Aideed was able to squirt out on the mission you talked about. But again, for the safety of the assault force going in initially, that's the way we decided to sequence it.
And the use of vehicles. So I love to tell the story. In the 90s, I used to do training missions on what we called helo trucks, meaning we couldn't afford or we couldn't coordinate to get us to use helicopters. So we would pretend that our vehicles were helicopters. Not me ever imagining that I would only conduct real operations my whole career from vehicles. So the fact that you guys were using vehicles, how well did you guys plan for that back in the States?
So the Ranger Battalion does have some vehicles, but we don't. At that time, we didn't drive Humvees or 5-ton trucks, and so that's one of the things we got to brag. It's like, hey, guess what? You're going to use Humvees and 5-ton trucks, and so we had to teach guys to drive those, kind of a little bit different. And the other interesting thing was these were not armored. So these were soft skin, the same level of armor as my F-150. So we were going to do the mission with that. So in addition to the helicopter assault force, we had a platoon, probably about 8 vehicles, 5-ton trucks and Humvees that we're going to drive from our base out to whatever target we were hitting, and that convoy would come link up with us. And then it would give us an option that we could drive out on those vehicles, or we could load prisoners on there, or they also mounted the 50 caliber machine guns and Mark 19 grenade launchers we talked about. So it'd bring some more firepower to the fight. But it was just a regular convoy, a soft skin we call vehicles. And the Rangers had to learn to drive those at Fort Bragg and then employed those in Somalia. So it was an interesting another asset.
Fast forward a little bit. On the afternoon of September 24th, Osman Atto was positively identified, and he was like the number 2 man in the SNA underneath Aideed. He was positively identified entering a small white sedan accompanied by a single bodyguard who drove the car. The assault force launched but maintained a distant orbit while the recon birds discreetly tracked Atto through the crowds. Looking ahead along the vehicle's route, the task force laid a trap on a relatively broad thoroughfare, just a few closely spaced buildings. Delta assault element was put on the ground after an AH-6 Little Bird stopped Atto's vehicle with a burst of warning shots into the road ahead of it. As Delta assaulters stormed up to the vehicle, the driver brazenly came out of the car with an AK-47. He was immediately neutralized with a leg shot. This is another example of the relative restraint that characterized our approach to the missions at the time. As the assaulters dealt with the driver, Atto fled into a nearby building. Assault teams began to secure and clear that and other nearby buildings, sorting through a number of Somalis they encountered. As the Delta assaulters questioned one of the Somali males, he confirmed he was, in fact, Osman Atto. As the Delta assault teams worked on the ground, Somalis in nearby neighborhoods began to react and converge on the intersection where the action was occurring. Fast forward a little bit. Upon landing, the leaders quickly moved to the TOC and received news that Atto had been positively identified. This was a major score for Task Force Ranger, boosting our confidence and simultaneously increasing pressure on Aideed. So it's a pretty good operation. Little vehicle interdiction, guy squirts away. It's interesting that the guy gets out of a vehicle with his AK-47 and they shoot him in the leg. Delta guys aren't shooting someone in the leg unless they're aiming to shoot someone in the leg.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
So that's just...
I talked to the guy after him. He said he did that intentionally, which is kind of unheard of today.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
That guy would not be a living human
kind of the opposite.
getting out of that vehicle with an AK-47.
And this mission, there's a number of learning points or things that this mission illustrates. You talk about that confidence that we had. So one of the contingency plans we had was, I mentioned there's 2 aircraft with snipers that would orbit over the top of the mission. And if one of those aircraft came out of orbit, and in this case, it came down and picked Atto up and flew him away, one of the contingencies was my aircraft that I was flying on, Super 6-4, would come in and backfill that. So you would always have 2 Blackhawks. So we did that on that mission. And I mean, so I got a ringside seat flying in Super 6-4 because we didn't get put on the ground. I had a ringside seat to this mission. And it also shows the Somalis were really wily. I mean, they were really smart about how they did business. They changed their profile all the time. Sometimes they'd ride in big, heavily armed convoys. Sometimes just one man, one bodyguard. Always changing that signature. We just happened to pick up Atto that day. And so they didn't put the whole assault force in. So I'm riding in Super 6-4. 6-4 comes in, becomes the second aircraft in the orbit. So I get a ringside seat to watch all this. And we're taking lots of ground fire. We can hear the machine gun rounds cracking around us. We can hear the RPGs going by as they're trying to shoot at us. But all that told me was, well, they can't hit us. We're as good as we think we are, and they can't hit us.
Speaking of which, fast forward just days later when a Black Hawk from the regular U.S. forces supporting the UN was hit by an RPG and shot down while patrolling over the city. Two of the crew members survived the crash but found themselves alone among the gathering Somalis. Fortunately, the crash had occurred not far from the neighborhood of a Somali clan friendly to the UN. The survivors were able to escape and evade the hostile Abergidar until they reached a nearby haven where a Somali family hid them until contact with the UN forces could be made. So there was, even though you had that high confidence, but also this is a regular U.S. aircraft, not a TF-160, which are the best pilots in the world.
They are, but you're alluding to exactly the point that I'm making is when you do this in combat though, you rationalize things to motivate yourself. And we were young guys, and so we thought, oh, we're Rangers, and that's Delta, and these are 160th guys, so they can't get hit. Yeah, the regular Army can get shot down, but not our guys. So we're rationalizing that a little bit.
Yeah. What we did not know was that a shadowy Saudi extremist named Osama bin Laden, then based in nearby Sudan, had offered Aideed the assistance of his group, Al-Qaeda, made up of Islamic terrorists. Some of the terrorists had been in the Afghan war against the Soviets and brought with them experience in modifying RPG launchers to enable them to be fired into the air. The shootdown of the U.S. helicopter was, in fact, a result of this Al-Qaeda assistance. So this was going to war with Al-Qaeda. Fast forward. While we were always postured and standing by to respond to an alert, on Sunday, October 3rd, the commanders gave us a break from the intensive training and daily signature flights. So you guys are in a little bit of a stand down scenario. Then you notice a bunch of activity around the TOC. You know that this means we're spinning up. Fast forward, according to the intelligence, a group of Aideed's top leaders were meeting near the Olympic Hotel in the vast Bakara market in the center of Abergidar territory. However, the Somali spy was providing the information did not believe that Aideed was present. Fast forward, another significant report was that a large group of about 400 militiamen who had been previously sent to Sudan to train with Al-Qaeda at the invitation of Osama bin Laden had recently returned to Mogadishu. These 400 newly trained fighters were now set up not far from the Bakara market. All of this information warranted our professional consideration, but to not overly concern or intimidate us. We had faith in our plan, knew our time limitations, and were taking over 200 of the best fighters in the world. We also knew the 160th would be overhead. And the time considerations, this is another thing that you mentioned that we didn't cover, but basically you guys realized you had like an hour to get the job done, and the Somali resistance couldn't organize quickly enough. If you were in and out in less than an hour, they wouldn't be able to really put up a decent fight.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we would rehearse this so many times that no matter how we hit the ground, we could do it in under an hour. We could, even if like Osman Atto did, squirt it out, we could track him down, get him on a bird, get out, collapse the whole thing. No matter what, we could do that in under an hour. And so it was pretty a well-oiled machine. Now, the other important part of that clock, though, is with my ringside seat to watching Osman Atto getting taken down, is you could see the Somalis assembling. And, it just takes them a while because they don't have communications and they're just trying to get everybody in the neighborhood together. And so they would throw tires out in the street. The tires would burn. Everybody would see the smoke, and then they would kind of react like militiamen or like Minutemen and come to that, and then try to get their act together and organize and get in the fight. But that was going to take them more than an hour to do that. And we could see that. We could see the resistance increasing as the clock was ticking on Osman Atto. And that mission took about 50 minutes. And at about 55 minutes, as the last guys were getting on the birds, the snipers were starting to engage threats. They were starting to take some ground fire, and you could see people coming. I mean, literally crowds coming down the street and people maneuvering to get in. So we knew that our hour template, our hour clock on the mission was valid.
How, in the book, I think at this point there's been like 4 or 5 missions on the ground. Is that about the right number?
Yeah,
that
six total up to before October 3rd. There've been 6 missions. Okay. That's right.
Fast forward, as the briefing went on, standing off to the side, consulting with Colonel Boykin, Major General Garrison weighed the risk. He too realized the dangers, but shared our faith in the plan, and this was too lucrative a target to pass up. While this new Somali intelligence source seemed somewhat tentative, the information he provided added up. The decision was made to launch. As the intelligence rep concluded his brief and made his last comments, the leaders began to move toward the door. I noted the heavy Somali security element again moved over to Colonel Boykin to ask if we would go in by getting rockets on the AH-6s today. He looked at me deliberately and answered, "Yes, Jim, you're getting the rockets." So there you go.
Yeah, so that's what we alluded to before, right?
Get these rockets on
the
there.
Level of security at the target, right?
The hangar soon echoed with orders to get it on, and the chocks moved out quickly through the mid-afternoon heat. And you guys had done a lot of spin-ups and scratches, you call them here, and this happens again. You guys go out, you get on the aircraft, then you're back off the aircraft, back on the aircraft. Finally, it looks like you're going. Hurrying back to Super 6-4, I climbed into the back and squeezed into place, packed in among the other Rangers, and waited. As I got settled in, I looked out the right side of the aircraft and noticed Bill Garrison moving among the birds. He had walked out of the TOC with the assault force and was now shaking hands and giving encouragement to operators, Rangers, and pilots as they saddled up in the aircraft. It struck me that he had never done this before. The assault force was soon reloaded and set aboard the aircraft.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation, we did many of the missions we did, or most of the missions we did, were within the Haber-Getter territory. And we knew kind of the conditions out there. But again, we had a lot of confidence. And 6 missions, we felt like we'd validated the things that we were confident in. But this one, it's a great point that we had actually spun up and stood down like 3 times in 2 days before this, over a 24-hour, but less than a 48-hour period. Gotten our stuff on, gone out to the aircraft, nope, scratch. So we were used to that. But on this one, I will say, it had a different feel, and we could see the level of security. I mean, we did not usually see that many Somali fighters on the ground, of the actual militia guys that were there pulling security, and the place that it was located next to, a lot of activity that was going on, very close in the Bakara market, lots and lots of Somali fighters there. So we knew it was high threat. I mean, we could feel that it was high threat, and obviously he knew it too. And because that was just one of those kind of ravens that fly into the picture. He came out and shook all our hands goodbye.
Getting into it. Fast forward, as the first wave of helicopters cleared the area, the 4 Ranger Blackhawks continued to come in slowly toward the target, trying to remain steady and allow the billowing dust to clear. Super 6-4 seemed to inch forward, still high above the rooftops as the pilots struggled to keep stability. Finally, we realized our Blackhawks were just renewing the milky, churning storm. It was obvious they could not get any lower. When the order was shouted for ropes out, there was another delay as one of the long, thick green ropes got hung up on a telephone wire. As the pilots jockeyed the bird forward to untangle it, Crew Chief Bill Cleveland leaned forward, out over his minigun, then finally called the rope clear and on the ground. We still seemed too high, far above the rooftops, as the aircraft began to hover in the cloud. Over the engine noise, we suddenly heard go, go, go. But the Rangers in the doorways hesitated for a brief second as we seemed far too high. Then the orchestrated surge began. As I pressed forward in the sequence, I watched the Rangers slide down, instantly disappearing into the milky cloud of brown. As the aircraft rotors thundered in my ears, I could see the rope swaying in front of me, just far enough out that I had to commit my body weight to reach it. So, had you guys been in brownout before on these other missions?
We had, but not this intense.
It was just gnarly.
For this one, for whatever reason, it was just the most amount of dust we'd seen, and we were trying to do things at night. So I'd say only 1 or 2 of the missions before had been in the daytime, and just for whatever reason, the conditions were much better on those, so we didn't have that much brownout. This one, like I talk about, it was classic assault. Though we came out of the west, out of the setting sun. and then started inching in, and just an unbelievable altitude that we were at. I mean, again, I relate it in the book, but we just could not believe they were going to put us out at that altitude.
So it's like 90 feet.
Yeah, it had to be fast rope. It had to be the full length of the fast rope, because there was multi-story buildings, and we were far above those. And again, after a point, you couldn't see the ground, so you knew you were still way up there, and we were waiting for them to go down and lower and settle in, and they never did. They're like, go, and we would just, a little bit of disbelief, but then Rangers are Rangers, and they just went, and it was on.
I finally crashed into the street. I took a few disoriented steps, slamming into a wall before getting my bearings. Amid the swirling dust and thunder of the helicopter above me, I heard another sound, sustained gunfire. As the Rangers around me on the south corners of the target buildings began to sort themselves out, it was obvious that those to the north were already in contact with the enemy. Fast forward, all around me, the Rangers at R1 on the southeast Ranger blocking position were set, facing outward amid the tight alleys and debris of the narrow street. Captain Steele and his radio operator, along with the Air Force CCT sergeant, clustered by a telephone pole a few feet behind me. So it's on when you guys get on the ground.
Yeah, and that was unique too, because the element of surprise, the fact that we could go anywhere in the city, that gave us that element of surprise. And so we never really had to assault into a fight. It would develop afterwards as Somalis kind of figured out where we were at and start probing. But probes are a lot different than attacks. And because of that security element that was on the ground, fortunately they all didn't stand and fight, but enough of them did that the fight was on, at least on the north side, pretty much the minute we hit the ground. Another kind of interesting point I want to make here about the template. So it's kind of hard to understand or visualize, but I never really knew where I was in the city, and I didn't have to. We had this template that we rehearsed over and over again, so I always went into the same place. I was always going to be at the southeast corner. The same teams went to the same locations around the target building. So all I had to do was know that's the target building right there, and I was immediately oriented. I knew I was in the southeast side. I knew who was on the northeast, northwest, southwest. I knew Delta was inside the house, so that's the orientation. But I never really knew where I was in the city. If you'd asked me to pull out my map and show you what street I was on, I wouldn't have been able to do that. All I knew was what the target house was, and if I was in the right spot, I was locked into that template, and that was my orientation.
So, looking back now, would you do more map study going in?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt. And I would encourage the convoy leaders to do a lot of map study.
Yeah,
right.
We were really paranoid. So my first deployment to Iraq, we were in Baghdad, and so we'd operate all around Baghdad. So we would get in a little bit of a similar mindset where we would basically know the target building and then a few blocks around the target building, and there would usually be some kind of a reset point. We'd come across a bridge, or we'd come to a big intersection with a big mosque on it. So I would always have at least one really good landmark in my head where, okay, now we're 3 minutes from the target, or it's two turns away.
Right.
But in Ramadi, what was awesome was just operating in the same streets all the time, over and over. And,
right.
You'd know the battle map. You'd be looking at, that's building 19, or that's building 4. Like, we had that familiarization. But looking back, I would say to myself, I should have had that much familiarization on all these operations when I was in Baghdad. And from Baghdad, we hit other cities as well. So just a good lesson learned for combat leaders out there. Man, get out that map and do a study and know some landmarks, because if you get turned around out there, it is a nightmare. Now, one thing that was really interesting for us was that first deployment to Iraq for us, the big army had these moving maps inside their Humvees with Blue Force trackers on them and stuff.
Right.
We didn't have those yet. We were a little bit ahead. We had been ahead probably 6 months ahead of the technology, and we'd got these Panasonic laptops we had figured out a way to put the satellite imagery on our laptops and put our GPS into those things. And so we had really good awareness of what was happening. And then because we still had a little paranoia of the technology, we would build what we called pace notes. So pace notes is something that we used to do for land nav. So for land nav pace notes, I would say, okay, I'm going from point A to point B in 80 or in 200 meters. I'm going to go down a river. Then after that, I'm going to notice on my left-hand side, there's going to be this thing. And I would write these pace notes down so that it would keep me from getting lost. Well, our navigators started making pace notes for for our transits to targets. So those were so helpful because you could take a look at the pace notes and they'd actually print them out. So they would print out, here's the intersection, here's what it's going to look like. Here's the next, here's the bridge that we're going to go over. There's going to be a sharp left turn. And so in my head, I could kind of follow the pace notes without even looking at a map. So I think those things were very helpful. And I was very appreciative of my point man that would put together these pace notes and kind of give me like the quick brief, like here's what we're going to see, here's what we're going to see. Again, these to me are just notes for combat leaders, man.
Right. Exactly right.
Those are good things to know.
And I think the other aspect of that is it goes back to checking other people's work, because your life depends on it. Your mission success depends on it. And so kind of some of the context, though, is we weren't what we call the battle space owners. We didn't own the ground out there. There was United Nations forces that owned the ground. We were coming into their area, hitting targets. And it's the same template that we carried on to Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think it's a really good, technique, like you're talking about. A thing that you got to do is check other people's work. We were dependent on them as the battle space owners, that if things went sideways and we were going to be fighting outside of the target area, that we would be depending on them. Well, again, your life and your unit success is dependent on it. So you should check other people's work and get familiar with their area, and not just be dependent on them to be able to bring the situational awareness to the fight. So it's a great point.
Yeah, and going to shake the hands of the people that own the battle space,
100%,
is highly recommended. And pulling out your battle map. Now, it was nice in Ramadi because we all got eventually coordinated on one big battle map that everyone had the same thing. But, we'd roll in. I learned this early in my first deployment. We'd roll into some battle space, go meet the company commander, and he had a battle map. So now we got our battle map, he's got his battle map, and we got different names for different buildings. That's a problem.
Oh, yeah.
So sorting that thing out is really important. The way you do that is coordinating amongst the conventional units. This is just, again, for the young combat leader out there. I used to ask these young SEAL leaders, I'd say, what's the most important piece of information you can have on the battlefield? And they'd say, where the enemy is, how many weapons they have, how many people they have, what their scheme of maneuver is. I'm like, no, none of that stuff matters compared to where you are.
Yeah.
You need to know where you are on the battlefield. If you don't know where you are, it doesn't really matter where you think the enemy is because you don't know where you are.
Right.
So, again, young combat leaders out there, do good map study, make some pace notes. It's going to pay off.
Yep.
Fast forward a little bit. Back behind me further to the west, I could see Sergeant First Class Sean Watson, the team leader at R4, directing his Rangers. I did not have visual contact with the Rangers at the R2 position to the north, but confirmed I had comms with my forward observer at that position by checking in with Specialist Joe Thomas on the radio. Similarly, Sergeant Jeff McLaughlin at R3 on the other side of the target building to the northwest, and Private First Class Jeff Young at R4 next to us to the west checked in on the radio as they covered those positions. So those are your direct guys.
Yep, those are the forward observers at the four different elements on the ground.
And you have good comms with them.
Got good comms.
Are they passing their requests through you?
Yes.
Is that the standard operating procedure?
They would identify a threat, and then I would hand the asset off to them, and I would deconflict and set priorities. And
while Delta continued to clear the building and the Rangers held our blocking positions, there was various activity involving Somalis around us. We were not in heavy contact now, but we were being targeted by individual gunmen lurking in the windows of the buildings and on the streets around us, taking occasional pot shots. You can just start to feel the escalation here.
It's starting to build, yeah.
Gunmen persists. Sergeant Bourne dueled back and forth with Somalis using well-aimed shots and controlled bursts of fire. In the middle of this exchange, a Somali woman walked across the intersection in front of our position, seemingly oblivious to the firefight. She casually raised her hands in a don't shoot manner. But then she began gesturing and pointing towards our location. So this is going to get ugly quick.
Yeah, and that's something I've, in 6 wars, I've never seen this again, is the civilian population, I think, just so used to fighting going on around them that they weren't, number one, weren't afraid to get involved. They're just walking through our positions. It wasn't a huge firefight, but there was some shooting going on, and people are just walking in the middle of it. And it just, you got to step back and say, well, I can't believe I'm seeing what I'm seeing. But she would just, in this case, she just walk in between the elements firing back and forth like she wasn't going to get shot, and then she was really scouting us out and pointing us out and really brazen. And I just one of these things, the first time in real combat, you're just not believing what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's again going back to Ramadi. It's like the women and kids weren't coming in the streets at all.
No.
You guys, you start dialing in some assistance, some support from the snipers on Super 6-1. Fast forward, the Delta assaulters had captured a number of key targets and were now bringing them down onto the street. We had one Ranger seriously injured on the north side. On the insertion, as the pilot struggled to keep the aircraft stable, Private First Class Todd Blackburn had missed the swaying fast rope and fallen approximately 90 feet to the street. The chalk leader there at R3 in the northwest, Sergeant Matt Eversman, had his hands full, working to move the unconscious Blackburn to a safe position, coordinate medical attention, and deal with the contact going on around his blocking position. Delta medics had moved out to R3 from the target building to assist and now continued to work on Blackburn. Sergeant First Class Bart Bullock, a hulking, dark-haired Delta assaulter and medic, assessed the 18-year-old Ranger's injuries as life-threatening.
Yeah, so a lot going on here too. And just to set some context, so I've, along with the rest of my position, the guys in my position, had fast roped in. We got the security perimeter around Delta in the assault building as they're going in and detaining all of Aideed's lieutenants. There's some contact going on. But the fast rope in, I'd mentioned how high we are and that we were browned out. Well, one of the difficulties of that I hadn't mentioned yet is that, anybody that's a pilot knows you have to have frame of reference in order to fly, especially maintain a hover in a helicopter. Well, in that brownout, we were literally in a cloud of dust, and the pilots had no frame of reference for horizon in order to keep that helicopter, stable and hovering. And this goes into fast roping. So a lot of people, in special operations see fast roping and don't have any equipment on, and you can basically do it with one hand and swing it around. Well, that's not how our fast roping was. We're wearing body armor, we're wearing our radios, we're wearing weapons. We're loaded down with about 100 and some pounds. And when you try to fast rope like that, it's a much different dynamic. And the other aspect of it is, you don't have that rope while you're in the helicopter. You got to jump out onto that rope in the rig that we were using in the Black Hawk. So you're basically jumping out of the Black Hawk, catching that rope, and then you're sliding down, and you're not going to be able to control how fast you're going. But in any case, with the pilots unable to keep that hover, that rope is moving. And so now you're at 90 feet, and that rope is moving with the helicopter, and you're trying to time it so you can catch that rope. And Blackburn, we got video of it. Blackburn missed that rope and fell 90 feet, so he's critically injured down there.
Colonel McKnight felt he had enough vehicles in the convoy to cut 3 loose and send them back to the airfield with the stricken Ranger. So they kind of make that call. Let's get him out of here.
They did. And so, again, the other part of the context is the convoy that we talked about, the 5-ton trucks and the Humvees with the heavy weapons, had driven from the airport. They go out to the target building. While we're getting the security, we've helicoptered in. While we're getting the security perimeter set up and assaulting, that convoy links up with us. Wasn't that far a drive. And those vehicles are now waiting to take the prisoners out, to take us out. And the Ranger Battalion commander who's with that convoy makes the decision to cut out some vehicles. Blackburn's injured. They're going to send them back to the airfield. Mm-hmm. So he gets immediate attention.
Those guys take off. This is interesting. You mentioned some of the Rangers mistakenly believed that Strucker's team was turning away from the growing contact and abandoning us.
Yeah, I'll never forget that. They're furious. They were just couldn't wait till they could catch up with him because they thought he ran away. And so just, interesting fog of war stuff.
Yeah. I've talked about it on this podcast. There's massive not surrenders, but retreats that took place in World War I because a runner was going from the front line to pass word, and they had to eventually tell runners, don't run back because it could cause panics. Yeah. They see one guy running, then another guy runs, the runner runs. Yeah. He's called a runner for a reason, and he starts running back to pass information. Someone sees him running, oh, we're running, and they could cause those panics to happen. Going back to the book, along the route of the 3 Humvees working their way through Habergitter neighborhoods, the Somalis were beginning to assemble and react en masse. The appearance of the U.S. vehicles in their midst drew hails of gunfire from buildings and alleyways along the route. The machine gunners in the turrets of the Humvees were firing constantly now, slewing their machine guns around to hammer windows and alleyways. Specialist Dominic Pilla, a tall, boisterous Ranger from New Jersey, manned a M240 machine gun in the back of Strucker's truck. He swung the machine gun around toward a Somali militiaman approaching from the alley. They fired simultaneously and the gunman dropped to the street, but Pilla also fell to the floor of the Humvee. He had been killed instantly by an AK-47 round to the head. The small convoy sped on, firing nonstop, but being shredded by the fire from the neighborhoods. What seemed like a lifetime later, Strucker drove his bloody and bullet-scarred vehicles through the gates of the airfield, moving directly to the Task Force Ranger compound. Meanwhile, back in my position at R1, Cliff Walcott called me to say he was coming back in over our position to take one more look at the Somali gunmen who had been harassing us. As I watched the Black Hawk come in low about 2 blocks out as it turned to scan the streets. When Super 6-1 passed in front of me, I briefly turned away, and as I looked back, I heard a muffled bang and metal grinding as the aircraft began to slew and twist unnaturally. Trying to process what I was seeing, I initially tried to reason that Cliff was turning hard for a shot, but in reality, I felt doom. As the aircraft spun, I caught a glimpse of Cliff and his co-pilot, Donovan Briley, through the windshield, fighting to maintain control. Then someone in the back of the bird lurching forward. Super 6-1 spun off to my left and out of sight to the north. Seconds later, I heard the ominous crunch of the impact. The calls began to reverberate across the radio net. 6-1 is down. We have a Black Hawk down. So what are you thinking now?
Yeah, so again, lots going on. It was controlled chaos for sure, but we were within the confines of our plan, our template, so it was moving forward as we needed it to. But now you cut off an element from the convoy. They're racing back. They got their own saga that we talked about. We didn't even know about that at the time. Like I said, some guys thought they were running. They didn't know that was a whole nother mission going on and drama for them. As I mentioned, I'm with my forward observers. We're trying to deal with threats. We had a threat in front of us. They'd stopped firing, so I told Cliff, who was the pilot of Super 6-1, one of the sniper birds, I told him, end of mission, go back up to a safe altitude. But again, these task force pilots are different than most pilots. They were just as aggressive as anybody on the ground, and Cliff's main focus was to get the snipers and door gunners in position for a shot. So he came over again, wanted to keep taking a look, and unfortunately got tagged. And like I said, your brain's trying to tell you one thing. Oh, it's okay. He's just trying to take a better shot. But it's like watching a car wreck. You know things are going out of control violently and dramatically. And that's what was happening here. We lost that bird. But yet the mission's continuing. We're still on the timeline. We're still on the template. So we're focused on getting the prisoners, the detainees out of that building and into the convoy and maintaining the perimeter, because at the same time, the clock's ticking and that resistance is increasing. So we still got firefights starting to grow all around us.
Do you feel like you still have the momentum and the upper hand at this point?
We did. Obviously, this was going to be a huge bump in the road, and again, it goes back to knowing where you're at, and I knew where I was at, but now we got a bird down 4 blocks away, and I don't even know what part of the city we're in, really. And he's down 4 blocks away, and we know we're going to have to deal with that. Mm-hmm. And so now these things are starting to creep up in your mind. You've got the plan that you're trying to stick to, and we're still executing that. But now the enemy's had a vote, and the chaos is starting to creep in just a little bit more and a little bit more.
But you still feel like you have like kind of the upper hand. Like we're still going to handle this.
Oh, without a doubt.
Okay.
I mean, we still were a cohesive force. We still had 40 assaulters on the ground and 70 some Rangers, and so we knew as the task force was still intact. And again, really, I can't emphasize enough. We could take on whatever. We felt like we could take on whatever came. Whatever they want to throw at us, we could take on. And that it gets down to one of the themes of the book, is because I knew the guys to my left and my right were not going to quit. And they were going to attack just as hard as I was going to attack. And so when you have a unit like that, with that kind of cohesion, we were professional. We knew there's thousands of people out there. And so we weren't looking to stir that hornet's nest. But we also felt like whatever they throw at us, we're ready.
Mm-hmm. So when 6-1 goes down, the pilots heroically had kept it together as much as they could, but when it impacted the ground, it hit a wall and it killed both the pilots. You end up with the crew chief and the Delta snipers are on board. One of the survivors, Dan Bush, he could be seen immediately climbing out of the wreckage. He ends up going back. Jim Smith, another Delta sniper, pulled Dan back from the corner. They're just like fighting it out. And finally, you get one of the Little Bird pilots, Chief Carl Meyer. Am I saying that right?
That's right.
He goes in, makes a landing. There's wires and there's rubble and there's all this, and the wreckage itself. He puts down cover fire. Jim Smith loads Dan Bush up there into the helicopter. The helicopter takes off, and then you get, I'm going to the book here, despite having just survived the crash with serious gash in his face, Jim Smith refused to get on board and remained behind to help hold the position. Like, these are the kind of human beings we're talking about. So and you get so many details in here. Get the book. Fast forward a little bit. When the call came in that Super 6-1 was down, a number of pieces in the contingency plans were ordered into play. In addition to Super 6-4 coming in to replace Super 6-1 in the orbit over the target area, the combat rescue team, to include my FO Butch, how do I say that?
Galliette.
Galliette.
Butch Galliette. Yep.
Butch Galliette was called in. So this is what you were talking about earlier. There's some contingencies that are going to start happening.
Right.
And they start happening.
Yeah, one of the amazing things about this battle is it's all on videotape. Mm-hmm. And so even though it's chaos and there's all these moving parts and more moving parts as the battle goes on, it's all on videotape because we had that P-3 Orion filming it. We had our own reconnaissance aircraft filming it in color. And so you can watch all this. You can watch Dan Bush crawl out of the rubble, the wreckage of the aircraft, to get on the corner, fighting, take a round. You can watch all these things happen. Carl Mayer flying in, so... Yeah, really amazing. Cliff and Donovan Briley and Super 6-1, some of the best pilots ever in the world. They keep that aircraft stable enough so that it can flat land, it can pancake in, but it hits a wall, crumples on top of them, and kills them. But they kept it stable enough so that the guys in the back survive, which is really amazing. Like I said, like we just read, the snipers crawl out, the crew chiefs crawl out, but again, now the context is they're 4 blocks outside of where the target area is. All these Somalis, that's where they're gathering. So they literally land like in a hornet's nest, immediately start fighting. We did have one more ace up our sleeve, and that was a combat search and rescue team. We had one aircraft dedicated with Air Force PJs and Rangers and medics on board. We immediately put that aircraft in. They fast roped in. One of those guys was one of my guys, Butch Galliette. I'd actually brought Butch with me from A Company. So he and I were 2 of the only guys from A Company that were with B Company that day. But he got committed with the combat search and rescue team, and now they're fighting on that objective.
And was he one of your guys being a forward observer?
He was. He was a forward observer. He was a E5, had just graduated Ranger School not too long before that. Was a sergeant, and he was a forward observer with that team.
And speaking of the video and everything, I forgot to mention this, but you mentioned in the book, when you hit the ground, you pulled out a camera and took one picture. Yep. And apparently it's the only photograph taken from on the ground in the whole battle.
Yeah, little 99-cent disposable Kodak camera. I'd taken 1 or 2 pictures out of the aircraft, but I kept telling myself, you got to remember to take a picture of a target. And so as soon as I got down, dust settled, I snapped off 1 picture of the target.
Fast forward a little bit. While the combat rescue team was fast roping onto the crash site, back at the target building, I watched the Delta assaulters coming out of the gate into the street. They loaded the prisoners on the 5-ton trucks as the Ranger convoy prepared to move, and we began collapsing the perimeter around the target building. Then a new order came down from the command aircraft over the radio net to the assault force on the ground, along with the combat rescue team now fighting to secure the crash site, and Lieutenant Di Tommaso's group moving in that direction. The remainder of the assault force would consolidate in the street and move by foot to secure the area around the crash.
Yeah, so I keep saying it, a lot going on. One of the decisions the commander made was to take one of the Ranger blocking positions and send them over because from their position, they were the closest friendly force to the crash site. So they sent some of those guys in the direction of the crash to help out because, again, we've stirred that hornet's nest up over there. They're fighting the minute they hit the ground with the wrecked helicopter, the crashed helicopter. At the same time, we're collapsing the perimeter. We're dealing with some enemy pressure, getting the prisoners on the convoy, getting ready to roll up the mission and extract. So these are the things that are going on. That's the decisions made, and what they're getting ready to make a decision. What are we going to do next?
Yeah, when you say there's a lot going on, you know, I watched the movie Black Hawk Down. I think many people watch the movie Black Hawk Down, and I think the way they try and convey it is just through a lot of chaos, right. And it's hard to tell what's happening. But there's just these little mini engagements happening all over the place, heroic actions taking place everywhere, decisions being made. Like it is full freaking chaos.
Yeah. This is where we started to feel, though, the plans start to coming off the rails. Mm-hmm. You know, I talked about if we operate and execute in accordance with the plan, and we get out within under an hour, everything's going to be smooth as silk. You know, we might have some little bump in the road, like Blackburn falling off the rope, but we could control all that. We had plenty of combat power and training and rehearsal to control all that. But now is when we start to feel it's starting to come off the rails. We got the CSAR teams gone in. We're trying to collapse the perimeter. We're still fighting. Not a lot of fighting at this point, but there's still more fighting than we'd experienced in any other mission. So we're getting pressure on the perimeter, and we're getting on the convoy, and we're starting to feel a little overwhelmed. You know, because again, you're talking less than 150 guys on the ground, and we knew full well the numbers of the enemy.
Back to the book, I looked down at this Seiko diver's watch strapped to my wrist. The luminous dial showed 16:30 hours, and I realized we had been on the ground for nearly an hour. This is what you were talking about. The world began to tilt now, out of the rehearsed sequence of the plan and registering the shock of contact with the enemy. Almost immediately, the assault force of Rangers and Delta operators began pushing east along the narrow streets. My stomach was in a cold knot now as I moved alongside Captain Steele. I knew the chances of survival were slim for the crew of the crashed helicopter. And now we get into, it's kind of what I started the book with, or started the podcast with, is when you can tell things are just starting to escalate. There's enemy fire is constant. The crowd's beginning to surge towards you guys. And this is what I was just talking about. You say at this point, the small unit training and leadership of the Rangers and special operators began to play a critical role. For each small group of Rangers, their world became centered on the street, corner, or alleyway in front of them. The fighting narrowed down through tunnel vision to just a few meters. In this type of combat situations, soldiers are forced to focus on the fight immediately around them. At the same time, they also know that the battle is raging well beyond their small piece of ground, and the enemy is out there closing in. They have to trust the men to their left and right, knowing they are standing fast and will not break, just as they are doing for their comrades. Yeah, the pressure is increasing.
Yeah, and this is where I really like the symbolism of a shield wall. And I get lots of people always talk to me about, oh, we got this technology, we got drones, we got this and that, got that. Well, you know, I've lived the example of that's not always gonna be enough, and it comes down to just like it did 2,500 years ago, like a shield wall. And you've got to fight what's in front of you, and you've got to trust the guys to your left and your right that they're going to fight what's in front of them, or you're all done. And you know, the interesting thing is I was young and naive at the time, but I never felt like we were going to get overrun. It never occurred to me that, we're all going to get killed here. I never felt any kind of panic like that because I just had so much faith in the guys to my left and my right. I was worried about Galliette. I was worried about Cliff Walcott and Donovan Briley because I knew somebody was going to be dead in that crash, so I was worried about that and being able to get there to help those guys. But I never was worried about being overrun or that somebody was gonna run and we were gonna collapse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the name of the book, With My Shield. You know, and that's what you talk about here is that Spartan shield wall. Survival comes not only from holding the enemy to your front, but dependence on the men around you. To take a step back or falter and leave the man beside you is exposed is inconceivable. You say I continued forward in the middle of the street alongside Captain Steele and his radio operator. As I advanced, I came across a wounded Ranger lying on his side of the road immediately in front of me. I was surprised to look down into the face of one of my forward observers, Sergeant Mike Goodale. Am I saying that right? Goodale?
That's right, Mike Goodale. Yeah.
He had taken an AK-47 round through the hip and was in pain, but seemed more surprised and frustrated at being hit than anything else. Without pausing, fixated on pushing forward to the crash site, I stepped over him and kept moving, knowing that a medic behind me would patch him up. To this day, I think back on that moment with waves of guilt, but also knowing it was the tactically correct decision to not stop and help him. Oof.
Yeah, there's a lot that comes back with that. But, that's one of the things, though, I'm trying to convey, and I convey more in some of the other examples, is not many cases. I mean, very, very few cases of guys being panicked or hysterical or scared of the fight and getting out of the fight. Like Mike, I looked down. His reaction was, damn, I'm out of the fight. I don't want to be out of the fight. I want to be back in the fight. And so that's lots of reactions like that day. So it's really, really hard to convey to people that can't understand the attitude that Rangers and operators bring to the fight.
Mm-hmm. The fighting continued and grew in intensity as the assault force began to move forward relentlessly. Nothing was going to stop us from reaching our comrades at the crash site. All around me, Rangers were rushing forward to cover, fighting to clear their corners, throwing grenades, or hammering down alleys with automatic weapons. Behind me, guarding the rear of the column, Watson directed his team's fighting to hold back the growing waves of Somalis. Watson's Rangers fought from positions along the street while they anxiously awaited for the rest of the column in front of them to move forward. His machine gun teams roared almost continually now as he calmly directed their fire, conserving precious ammunition when possible. Sean Watson was an old school Ranger and a plank holder, meaning as a young private he had joined the 3rd Battalion when it was originally formed in 1984. Now he was a consummate Ranger platoon sergeant with a strong personality and sarcastic, dry wit that was legendary in Bravo Company. He was the driving force behind his Ranger platoon, and his calm but forceful leadership was now holding them together in the dusty streets as the battle grew in intensity. One of Watson's machine gunners, Pete Nethery, saying that right?
Yep.
Was firing from a good position while covering the streets in front of him when an AK-47 round suddenly tore through his arm. Almost simultaneously, Doc Strauss, the Ranger platoon medic with Chalk 3, was also hit by a round. Fortunately, the bullet struck one of his smoke grenades Strauss was carrying, setting it off in a small explosion, engulfing him in a white cloud of smoke. Strauss emerged from the smoke and debris with his uniform and equipment badly torn. Otherwise uninjured, he immediately rushed across the street to Nethery. The incoming Somali fire cracked all around Strauss as he dragged the wounded Ranger to a safer position and went to work on his mangled arm. So the casualties are starting to mount up here.
Yeah, guys are starting to fall all around us as the fighting is picking up. And it seemed to me like every step we took, every second that went by, just increased level of fighting and intensity of the combat. One of the things about that passage, too, is we talked about the young guys in the battalion, a lot of 18, 19, 20-year-olds. But we also had, in our rank structure, platoon sergeants, our first sergeant. We had a lot of senior guys, and they're absolutely the critical glue that held everything together. In the way the mission was laid out, Sean Watson was a sergeant, but he was in charge of that blocking position. But when the assault element came back together and started moving towards the crash site, he was in charge of the rear guard. And he literally was back there doing what Ranger senior NCOs do best, is just controlling machine guns, controlling the fire. And it wasn't like a lot of Hollywood heroics of up yelling and follow me. It was very calm, very cool, under the most intense conditions, but just controlling those machine guns and taking out fire. And a lot of it at close range, because now they're starting to close with us, and just very calmly and coolly just directing his guys, and just a rock of leadership, Sean Watson back there. And I got a lot of this from Kenny Thomas. One of the great things about writing the book is I've told the story a bunch, so I wrote that out. But then I had to go back and research and fill in some gaps. And Kenny Thomas, one of the squad leaders there, wrote a book, and I got this from talking to Kenny and from reading his book. And so it was happening like within meters of me. I mean, I could almost see it out of my peripheral vision. But like we talked about, I was focused on what was in my front, very close to me. And Kenny and Sean Watson and those guys were fighting right behind me. And so I talked to them and got some clarification. So that was one of the great things about writing this, is I got to research it and fill some gaps in.
And the distance that you guys are trying to travel is 4 blocks. Is that right?
That's it, totally. Yep. About 2 blocks to the east and 2 blocks to the north.
And what worries me here is, as you take casualties, obviously your mobility slows down. Now you're trying to get people to move. You're trying to move them down. Moving down men, again, speaking of Hollywood, is a hell of a lot harder in real life than it is when you see a guy in a movie like throw someone on their shoulder and run like it's no problem. So that's going to, you're starting to get bogged down.
Right. Definitely slowing us down. Yep.
Continuing on here, around Watson's Rangers shooting down the streets and pouring fire from the upper stories of surrounding buildings, the Somalis continued to hammer into the column of Americans. Across the street from Watson, Sergeant Kenny Thomas fired at the darting Somali gunmen while throwing hand grenades over the walls around his position. Fast forward, as the rear column under Watson held fast, the Delta assaulters up front continued working their way forward. And then fast forward, I moved up a few steps behind a team of Delta assaulters working their way forward along the wall to our right. Suddenly they began to jerk and twist like they were being stung by bees as bullets ripped along the wall. The assaulter in the lead, jovial and friendly Earl Fillmore, dropped forward and hit the ground with dead weight. Fillmore and the rest of the Delta assaulters wore black plastic hockey helmets rather than the heavier bulletproof Kevlars. Fillmore had just taken an AK-47 rifle round to the forehead, killing him instantly. The rest of the team behind him was wounded in the same burst of fire. They dove for cover in a narrow alley to the right, dragging Fillmore's lifeless body with them. Fast forward, I realized I should be talking to my forward observers and the helicopter gunships to bring in fire support rather than engaging in the firefight with the Somalis behind the berm. But the question was, why were none of my forward observers calling? Just minutes prior, around the target building, I had clear communications with the helicopters above and my forward observers on the ground. But now all I was getting in my radio headset was faint static, moving back from the tree toward Captain Steele and taking scant cover behind a slight rise in the road to my front. I began to go through my checks. I pulled out the handset of my backup radio and was met by a roar of calls from my forward observers. So you had a bad radio. Radio been hit or was bad?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting part of this. When we first got formed up into the task force, and I'll get a little technical for a minute, but it'll all work out.
Is this the UHF VHF?
This is the UHF VHF thing. So, God bless the Air Force, God bless CCT guys, but that's who did fire support for Delta. And again, being the junior partner to come to this task force, we were told you're going to switch from our FM radios that we use to UHF, which is what the Air Force uses. But we had used FM radios. I mean, that's what the Army uses. That's what guys on the ground use is FM radios. And we trained that way forever. And the 160th guys were used to that. They worked with us on it. But the CCT aspect of Delta said, no, we're going to use UHF radios. And we protested, but to no avail. I was told, take your new radio. And
so they gave you a full new radio?
Oh, yeah. Every one of us had to get a brand new radio. And we were familiar with them, but that wasn't our standard. It wasn't so much the equipment, it was the frequency, right? So, but we had to get new radios in the training at Fort Bragg and integrate into that. So we got out there and started doing our missions. But again, this is standard, again, for the junior leaders, this is standard communications planning, PACE plan, have a backup plan. So we had a number of backups, and that's standard, but I also didn't trust the UHF radios. And so we carried little handheld FM radios in our cargo pockets of our pants as a backup means for communications. Now, the problem was on the ground with the UHF radios that I carried on my back. I had it in a headset, and I could monitor it. And so it's in my ear continually, and so I'm able to monitor any calls that I might get in. It's not like I had to reach down and get a handset. It was in my ear already, but I wasn't getting anything. And so then I had to start thinking, why am I not getting anything? I know something's going, wrong here, and that's when I went to my backup and found that they were on the backup radio. The UHF radios were not working on the target. We can go into why. So what we didn't know, and you're not going to know because you don't, if you hadn't trained on it, hadn't gone through it extensively, you're not going to know things like this that happen in combat. But when aircraft get shot down, they have a UHF emergency transponder beacon, and that beacon puts out a signal of where that crash site is. Well, the transponder beacon on that Black Hawk that was right in front of us was going off, and it jammed every other UHF frequency around us. And so as we got close to that Black Hawk, that emergency transponder jammed our radios so we could not talk, and we had to go to the backup FM radio.
Back to the book, I focused on the calls from Specialist Joe Thomas, who is now in position at the crash site with Lieutenant Tom DiTomaso. I approved his request almost immediately for support from the AH-6 gunships that I knew would be orbiting overhead waiting to assist. You guys start doing some close calls. You tell the guys get their panels out. Like, that means we want you to know exactly where we are. This was a good point. I remembered veterans of Operation Just Cause telling stories about the invasion of Panama and the tragedy involving the gunships. During that past operation, when Rangers had called in AH-6 gunships for support, a miscommunication had caused a fratricide event where at least 2 Rangers from 3rd Battalion were accidentally killed by friendly rocket and minigun fire. Although they were not to blame for the tragic incident in Panama, I knew this weighed heavily on the pilots of the 160th, as they demonstrated now. They were risking everything, even to the point of recklessly exposing themselves and their aircraft to enemy fire in order to prevent it from happening again.
Yeah, unbelievable event. I mean, finally got the gunships on the radio. They were standing by, ready to go, transmitted. I knew those guys. I'd known them for 3 years, trained with them for this mission, immediately ready to go. And I thought, okay, here we go. We're about to get all this firepower coming in. And what I get is a helicopters flying rooftop level right over the top of us. And every Somali gun pointed up in the air and shot at those helicopters. But all 4 of them did it because, like I said, they were not going to shoot friendlies. They were going to, no matter what happened, they recklessly exposed themselves to make sure they knew where we were at and keep us safe.
Fast forward, while I was talking with the gunships, a Delta operator, Sergeant Norm Hooten, appeared in a doorway immediately to my right. He yelled for Captain Steele and me to come in off the street and take cover. As logical as that seemed, at that moment, we could not. Rangers were fighting in the streets all around us, and as leaders, we had to remain there exposed along with them. Just as importantly for me, I had to be in position to observe the impact of the gunship rounds and confirmed they were on target and striking safely outside of the friendly positions. I could not do that from inside the building. As seconds passed, I waited for the gunships to come around and line up again, another voice broke in on the radio. It was a faint call saying that Super 6-4 was down south of the objective and needed assistance. Minutes before, when Super 6-1 had been shot down, our Ranger Black Hawk Super 6-4 flew back into the target area in accordance with the pre-established contingency plan. Now Super 6-4 had also been hit by an RPG and crashed about a mile south of us. So now you must feel even more of that tilt of things going sideways.
Yeah, and it's a case of, again, you're fighting what you got in front of you, but things are spinning out of control and you're getting overwhelmed. And so, I knew the contingency of Super 6-4 coming in, but did not know they were shot down until somebody broke in on the radio net with that call sign. But again, this is chaos going on, controlled chaos, and you've got to disregard that. I had to cut them off and disregard that and say, hey, we're prosecuting a fire mission. I mean, they're getting ready to shoot right now, so you've got to get off the net. Mm-hmm. I did get a message from the command and control aircraft that they were working on some sort of contingency, and I was able to pass that to them at some point. And again, it turned out to be Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart on the ground that I was talking to. Didn't know that at the time, but you've got to cut them off. I mean, almost brutally, because I got an aircraft coming in shooting right now, and it's a lot of lives on the line.
Yeah, I mean, you say in the book, just seconds later, I finally heard the AH-6 firing with chainsaw sound of Gatling guns, followed by the rip and boom of the 2.75-inch rockets. The firing was so close that spent shell casings rained down on us, and we could hear the shriek of the rocket motors before impact. From my position, I raised my head to observe the strikes impacting the vicinity of the Somalis just past the berm to my north. Reaching back down for the hand mic of the backup radio, I quickly checked in with my forward observer specialist, Joe Thompson, confirmed. He responded, fire for effect, telling me the rounds were on target and hitting where we wanted them.
Yeah, just the geographic context. Joe Thomas is like right on top of the crash site, so the aircraft is like literally right next to him. I'm only like 50 meters back. I'm not far back at all, but I'm far enough back that my radio wasn't getting jammed. His was. So he's talking to me on the handheld, relaying to me just about 50 meters away. We're all under the same direct fire, but he's right up next to the aircraft. And I was able to get through in my UHF and talk to the attack helicopters. And for me, that's the critical point of the battle right there.
When you guys finally started getting the helicopters dialed in and they started laying down that fire?
Yeah, because there was so much chaos going on. I mean, everybody's fighting, and we're talking about fighting at ranges of like 10 meters to 50 meters. With only a small number of us and thousands of Somalis converging, it was getting to the point it was more than we could handle.
Mm-hmm. Like even ammunition-wise,
magazines. I mean, you didn't have time to change mags. That's how close it was. It was so many guys coming at you. But when we got that firepower going, the attack helicopters just crushing that neighborhood, what that gave us, it didn't kill everybody around us, but it killed the people coming. Mm-hmm. And so it allowed our guys to deal with everybody that was in the perimeter, clear out the wall right in front of you, clear out the building just to your right, and then the guys that would have been coming to backfill them, they were getting engaged by the attack helicopters. It gave us some breathing space.
Mm-hmm. Fast forward a little bit. Even as the little birds tore into the Somalis approaching the crash site, there were still numerous gunmen all around us. Just seconds after I sent my last transmission to Barber 5-1, I felt bullets cracking very close to me and watched them punch 2 holes in the wall of metal shed just feet away from my rear. Knowing that Sergeant Kenny Thomas and some of the Rangers in his squad were just beyond the shed behind me, I was afraid they might be firing across my position. I called out, "Ranger, Ranger," which was our verbal recognition signal between members of the task force. As I was trying to yell above the growing din, I felt an impact on my right leg like an electric shock, followed instantaneously by an explosion of blood and bone. I had been hit by an AK-47 bullet which shattered my leg and felt like being struck full force by a sledgehammer. The firing came from a Somali gunman who was hidden unseen behind a stone wall on the other side of the street and just feet away to my left. He had popped up with his AK-47 over the wall and snapped off a ragged burst. As he fired down into our position, the third round had struck me in the leg. When the gunman started firing, Mike Steele had immediately rolled violently away to his right, then pulled his radio operator with him. His reaction had been automatic to the bullets peppering the streets and walls around us. Both men ran into the immediately adjacent building, which Delta assaulters had just secured minutes before. Now I found myself lying wounded and in agony in the dusty street. In shock, I prayed to be able to get home to see Beth and my unborn daughter. I began to drag myself, trying to follow Captain Steele toward the building to my right. Then Delta medic Bart Bullock came charging out of the doorway toward me. As the firefight raged, he grabbed the heavy strap on the back of my armored vest and dragged me out of the firing and through the doorway into a tiny courtyard. Another one of the sergeants pressed me down and tried to reassure me as I struggled to control the pain. Blood poured from my shattered leg, spreading out into a pool around me on the dirty floor of the courtyard. Bullock immediately went to work, reaching into the wreckage of my leg, packing the multiple holes with fists full of a special clotting bandage. Quickly, he pushed the needle of an IV of fluid into my arm to replace my blood loss. He then half rolled me over, cutting away a flap in my pants to expose my backside, and injected me with a syringe of morphine. The drug rolled in and pushed the intense pain away. He told me to make sure I let any other docs who treated me later know I'd already been given 1 dose of the powerful painkiller. After a few minutes, starting to stabilize, I asked Bullock if the bleeding had stopped and then for his assessment. He said it was bad. There were a couple big holes in my leg, but amazingly the bleeding had stopped. "Can they save it?" I asked. He was non-committal, but said it may be possible. The initial sight of my blood flowing around me and the damage to my leg left me shocked, but I thank God for the miracle that the bleeding had stopped. So now you're hit.
Yeah, priorities start to coalesce, survive. That's the first thing. And you know this, Jocko, but in a close firefight like that, I mean, you're feeling it more than you're seeing it or hearing it. As far as the rounds, that the energy of those rounds going around, you're feeling that crack. That gunshot itself is a secondary thing. There's so much energy, and so that's literally what I felt. Is I felt the energy of 3 rounds going by me, and that third one hit me. And you get these guys talk about, "Oh, I took a round through the arm, and I didn't even feel it." Man, I want to know how they did that because I felt that one. I mean, it hit me hard. And, it's an important part about Mike Steele being there in the street next to me and reacting to contact. I mean, that's something you train. You train how to react to gunfire like that, and that's what he did. But it doesn't change the fact, I mean, next thing you know, I'm by myself and pretty badly wounded. And all I'm doing, emphasize there is that for Bart to come out and to get me, I can't emphasize enough how much I owe him for that.
I believe the expression is you owe him your life.
I do owe my life. I do owe my life.
Yeah, what a beast. Fast forward outside of the room where the medics worked on my leg, Delta Assaulter Norm Hooten was firing out of the window down the street. Now Hoot went into action. Using the M203 40mm grenade launcher, he blew a hole through the wall where the gunman who had shot me was hiding. Charging across the street and through the hole, Norm took the gunman out, then raced back through the Somali fire and into our building. Hoot would eventually earn the Silver Star for his heroism that day. How'd that morphine affect you mentally? Like,
well,
I've never been injected with morphine before. Is it like, is it a drunk thing? Is it just a lack of feeling thing?
No, it's not a drunk thing. That's the amazing thing is, I mean, especially with obviously dealing with pain, right? So you got such intense pain, and all of a sudden that pain starts to recede, right? And you start to calm down, and that pain's receding. And what I actually had to fight against was thinking that I could do stuff that I couldn't do. And again, with those gunships and calling that stuff in, you didn't need Jim Lechner on morphine trying to do that. And so that's what I had to fight against is I want to be back in this fight, but at one point I thought I could stand up. And that's when Bart said, hey, you're on drugs. And literally, you're on drugs. So that's not going to happen. So, I mean, that's the thing is it's difficult with your judgment.
Did it hit bone? The round hit bone?
Yeah, that's why it hit me so hard. So I lost 4 inches of my tibia, my shin bone. It just exploded, and that became shrapnel and shredded my leg, and then it followed my tibia down and came out by my ankle. But that bone, that 4 inches of tibia, was quite a bit of shrapnel that blew a grapefruit-sized hole in the front of my leg, and then the bullet tore up the rest of my leg. So,
and yet the bleeding, it seems like it didn't hit artery or something.
Well, the other interesting thing the doctors told me is that it turns out I have 3 arteries, and I had 3 arteries in that leg, and the bullet actually took out 2 of them. So if I'd only had 2 arteries, they would have had to amputate. But I had 1 artery running down the back of my leg that most people don't have, and so they were able to save the leg. But yeah, it was arterial bleeding. It was.
So it did hit arteries.
It took out.
Did they tourniquet you up or?
It's the miraculous thing. He didn't tourniquet me.
Mm-hmm.
He was able to get quick clot stuff into the hole, and he had pressure pants on me, but he didn't have a tourniquet on. Because today, immediately right to the tourniquet. Well, I probably would have lost my leg because it wasn't 10 hours later till I got to the hospital. So in a way, I thank God that we weren't doing then what we were doing today. So it was able to stop the bleeding with that quick clot. I don't really know how. Again, 2 arteries blown out, but that's kind of the miraculous thing. If you go to people have gone to Fort Benning, the museum there, and my boot that I was wearing on my left leg is in that museum. I donated it, and there's a blood stain on the back of it that's about 3 inches thick, and that's the depth of the blood that we were laying in the pool there. And most of it was mine.
Fast forward a little bit. At this point, the AH-6 Little Birds were focused on supporting the fight around the first crash site. This left Super 6-2 and the other Black Hawk carrying the Delta snipers as the only available aircraft to help. One of Super 6-2's crew chiefs manning a door gun was wounded. Delta sniper Brad Halling immediately jumped behind the door gun to take over and continued firing. Super 6-2 began to take more hits, and that pilots knew they would be unable to stay in the air much longer. The entire task force waited for the reaction force, but confidence in their arrival began to ebb. Everyone on board Super 6-2, as well as those listening on the task force radio net, knew the situation. The promised help was showing no signs of arriving soon, and based on our previous observations of other incidents in the city, its timely arrival would be unlikely. Knowing this, the 2 remaining Delta snipers on board Super 6-2, Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randy Shughart, repeatedly requested that the pilots put them on the ground near the second crash site to assist our wounded comrades of Super 6-4. Twice these requests were relayed to the officers in the command bird, and twice they were denied. Observing the now approaching crowds of Somalis and out of options to save the crew of Super 6-4, the commanders finally relented, and soon Super 6-2 landed near the crash. Gordon and Shughart jumped out of the Black Hawk and moved quickly through the alleyways and debris to locate the wreck of Super 6-4. Moving to the front of the aircraft, they simultaneously engaged approaching Somalis and lifted Mike Durant out of the cockpit. Placing Durant under an overhang, they left him with a rifle and moved back into the fight. Armed only with their sniper rifles, the Delta operators returned to the wreck, taking weapons from the aircraft, and continued to engage Somali gunmen who approached the crash site. As the Somalis pressed in, Randy Shughart heard the sound of Gary Gordon cry out as he was hit on the other side of the wreckage. He wished Mike Durant luck and moved back into position with an M16 rifle he had secured from the wreckage of the helicopter. Holding as long as they could, the Americans at the second crash site were finally overwhelmed as the gunmen and mass of the crowd overran the site. As they had done with the Pakistanis and Nigerians earlier in the summer, with brutal and cowardly savagery, the Somalis killed the wounded Americans. Amid the wreckage, the Somalis beat and tore at the bodies of the dead American soldiers. The crowd swarmed across the crash site and pushed to the spot where Mike Durant lay injured and nearly helpless off to the side. They immediately attacked the badly wounded pilot with their fists, sticks, and rifle butts. The snarling cloud of Somali faces parted, and Durant felt something heavy smash into his face. Looking up from the ground, he saw that one Somali had begun to beat him with the severed arm of one of the dead Americans. Suddenly, gunshots rang out, warning the attackers away. There was momentary hesitation and some argument before the crowd closed back in and seized Durant, lifting him above their heads out of the wreckage and into the nearby streets. Randy Shughart and Gary Gordon.
Yeah, so that account actually comes from a number of different sources. Me talking to Mike Durant, my knowledge of what went on, being on the radio with them, probably one of the last people to talk to those guys on the radio when they tried to call in. And then from your podcast, from listening to Mike Durant on here, I did not know some of those details until Mike talked on your podcast, so I got some of that. And I've mentioned before, this is one of those battles. Every time I listen to somebody talk about it, I learn more stuff. So that's where that account came from. Another blessing about writing this book was I had to go back and research. And I talked to a bunch of the air crew, the guys from Super 6-2 that are alive still today, and some of the operators, and learned a bunch of things about that attempt to save those guys on the ground. So there's a number of things in the book that no one was able to connect the dots on before. Some new information. Yeah,
no, it's a great account. It really is. The heroism from those guys, it's Medal of Honor for those two warriors.
Absolutely. And one of the key things here on that account is a lot of people just think that they were just going to go down there and do their best, the two of them. But there was actually a plan. The plan was Carl Mayer, who had previously lifted Dan Bush out of the crash site, had dropped Dan off at the hospital, and he was going to come back. Well, he did. He came back, and they located that second crash site, and then he landed his little bird about 4 blocks south. And the plan was they were supposed to, Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart were going to extract the crew and get down to Carl Mayer's aircraft and be evacuated. And that's what they were trying to do. It was a long shot, a forlorn hope, but they did have a plan, and they just weren't able to execute it.
Fast forward a little bit. While the drama played out at the second crash site with Super 6-4, the Ranger Convoy continued on its own tragic odyssey. The convoy had been in contact with the enemy since its arrival near the target building earlier in the mission. When they had first arrived, as the vehicles waited to be called forward to the target building, the Somalis had begun to fire on them. A rocket-propelled grenade struck one of the three large 5-ton trucks and disabled it. The driver and his partner were able to escape the vehicle and load onto another truck. The overall mission had then changed with the downing of Super 6-1. The convoy was now ordered to move to the crash site of Super 6-1, bringing along the Somali prisoners and some of the assault force who were already loaded up and on board the trucks. But events began to conspire against the task force at this point, and the convoy suffered the brunt of the consequences. The Somalis were experienced street fighters in the heart of their home ground. They barricaded the narrow avenues approaching the crash site with burning tires and the wrecks of cars. The clock was also working against us as we'd now been on the ground for over an hour, and the Somalis were massing in the thousands and approaching the contact area guided by the usual system of burning tires. As the trucks departed the initial target building, moving along the main thoroughfares, they were met with a storm of small arms and RPG fire. The convoy passed through this gauntlet of fire, exposed in the unarmored vehicles, and halted, unable to turn down the narrow and barricaded road to the crash site. Trying to navigate with only general references through the streets and under intense fire, the convoy commander, Lieutenant Colonel McKnight, pleaded for assistance from the aircraft overhead to find a viable route. As instructions were sent down from the various aircraft, including the P-3 Orion surveillance plane, they had to pass through multiple layers of communication from the command bird before finally reaching McKnight. Anyone who's led a convoy knows this is a difficult proposition under the best of conditions. In a maelstrom of enemy fire and chaos of combat, it is all but impossible. The Rangers assigned to the vehicles, along with those who had jumped on board with the Somali prisoners, fought back desperately against the fire coming from all sides. The convoy's heavy weapons, the 50 cal machine guns, Mark 19 grenade launchers mounted on the trucks roared continuously as other Americans fired their weapons out of the windows and over the sides of the vehicles. But the concentrated fire of the Somalis began to take its toll. Some of the vehicles were hit and disabled by rocket-propelled grenades, forcing the Americans to bail out. Under heavy fire, Delta operators and Rangers began to fall in the street and onboard vehicles. Yeah, it's mayhem.
Mayhem. Yeah, it's a perfect word for it. Yeah.
It's you know, we got so good at this sort of ground operations and convoys and convoy operations and how to operate and how to do and what the risks were. Like that just became part of our, part of what we do in the global war on terror in Iraq, especially in an urban environment. We also eventually got armored vehicles. We had, jamming things for landmines. It was like a totally different game. And these guys out here, even like the fact that we would drill like a freaking NASCAR pit crew to change tires, to rig for tow. We had our whole vehicles were set up. If we needed it, we could get a vehicle rigged for tow in like 30 seconds. We could get tires changed like a NASCAR pit crew. Everyone knew how to drive the vehicles. Everyone knew how to operate the vehicles. We were really experienced at it. These guys in this chaos and in totally unarmored vehicles, it's horrifying to read.
Yeah, just learned to drive them about a month before. Like I said, unarmored. And then the other thing too, in the context of Afghanistan and Iraq, at least in Iraq for sure, you always had a battle space owner, and they may have been a good distance away, but you knew where you had checkpoints, you knew where you had outposts that you could rely on. We didn't have any of that in Mogadishu. There wasn't any, especially where we were at. And we knew we were striking enemy territory, but inside that enemy territory, there wasn't any friendlies anywhere near us.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's one of those things. I remember Leif, Leif, because he was with us in Ramadi, but Leif he'd gone back to talk to some of the junior officers, and they were kind of theorizing about calling a QRF. And they were given a brief, and they were kind of brushing off. If I remember the story correctly, Leif was telling me, they were kind of brushing off, like, well, if we need a QRF, we'll call them over here. And Leif asked a couple questions, like, well, hey, where exactly, and what is their recognition symbol going to be, and where are their lanes of fire going to be? Leif started drilling down, and the guy kind of was like, well, I mean, it's not like we really would ever have to call the QRF. And Leif said, I've called the QRF so many times I can't remember. Right. But that's the kind of thing, when I was a young SEAL in the 90s, the QRF was one part of a brief, it was 2 words. We'll call the QRF. They're going to come to this point over here. We didn't think about who they were, what weapons they had, how to manage their fire, what lanes of fire we didn't think about that stuff because we just didn't know.
Doesn't become important until it becomes important.
Continuing on here, Sergeant Casey Joyce took an AK round 47 through the back where his protective vest had no armored plate. Round went through his body, struck the front plate, bounced back into him, fatally wounding him. Corporal James Cavaco, am I saying that right?
That's right.
Provided covering fire with a Mark 19 in one of the truck turrets. Suddenly, Cavaco was also struck by a round and died as he slid down inside of his vehicle. Yet another situation. Rangers of his platoon picked him up off the street and threw him in the back of a Humvee, which also held Delta operator Master Sergeant Tim Grizz Martin. Martin was well known in the task force, partly due to his badly scarred face from a previous accident, but also because he was one of the most amiable and competent Delta operators in the assault force. He had climbed on board the truck back at the target building to help secure Somali prisoners. Aboard that same Humvee, another one of my forward observers, Private First Class Chris Carlson, provided covering fire as the injured Rodriguez was loaded into the truck. Carlson had felt an explosion rock the truck, deafening him as another RPG struck and blew Grizz Martin and Rod out of the back of the vehicle. The rocket wounded Rod again, tearing off the back of his left thigh, but Grizz took the brunt of the blast in his lower half of his torso, fatally wounded. Somehow managed to still cling to life. A convoy situation was not improving. It had now cleared the main gauntlet of fire but missed the turn again. The aircraft orbiting overhead far above the chaotic maelstrom of the battle directed it to turn around and go back the way it had come. Things now began to all but disintegrate for the convoy. More vehicles were hit and disabled as there were more casualties every minute. When a Ranger manning a 50 cal machine gun in the turret of one of the Humvee's trucks went down with a wound, he was immediately replaced by Ranger Sergeant Lorenzo Ruiz. Minutes later, Ruiz took an AK-47 round to the stomach just under his bulletproof plate. Tough but amiable, Ruiz insisted he was all right, but died later alongside Grizz Martin in the casualty collection point on the airfield. One of the two remaining 5-ton trucks in the convoy was being driven by Private First Class Richard Kowaleski. The vehicle rocked with the impact of a rocket-propelled grenade that slammed through the driver's side door. The round hit Kowaleski square in the side, severing his left arm and killing him instantly. The rocket had penetrated the steel door but failed to detonate, remaining impaled in the young Ranger's chest, tail fins, and nose protruding out either side of his body. The convoy situation now became a question of survival, down to one barely running 5-ton and a few shot-up Humvees. Almost everyone, including the Somali prisoners, had been hit. So this is just, it's
a maelstrom.
Yeah.
And it's just some context too. So again, as things start to change at the target building, the convoy had arrived, as we'd mentioned, and some of the assaulters with the prisoners that had hit the target initially got on the convoy with the prisoners, and one of the blocking positions also got on the convoy. So when we were directed to move to the crash site, the assault element, the guys that had gone and hit the target initially, the operators and the Rangers from the helicopters, they were told to walk 2 blocks east and 2 blocks north. The convoy couldn't do that because the streets were so much wreckage and so tight. So the convoy had to find a different route. So now you got another group going in a different direction. And again, some of our guys, some of our combat power had gotten on that convoy. So the assault element that had gone to the crash site was much reduced. And a lot of those guys were on that convoy, among them Grizz and some of the other guys that had gotten killed. So.
Going back to the book here a little bit forward, decision was made to call off the attempt to reach the crash site and turn back. Gallagher, which this is Sergeant First Class Bob Gallagher, he's a platoon sergeant for the Rangers. Gallagher took the lead now and the convoy and pushed south toward the airfield, still fighting but crawling along with just a few vehicles left running, including one truck pushing another that had been disabled. Every vehicle is loaded with casualties. Back at the airfield, the Tactical Operations Center personnel watched the raid and then the widening battle unfold on video screens. Major Craig Nixon, my former company commander and one of the Ranger staff officers, strove to put together a second Ranger convoy to join the fight. To form this convoy, Nixon was able to scrape together a handful of other Humvees, a few of which were lightly armored, and even those couldn't stop a rifle or automatic weapons fire. Nixon quickly put together a convoy with the task force had left for manpower. Joining the vehicles and crews from the infantry platoon, cooks, supply sergeants, and clerks now volunteered to join the new convoy. These Rangers illustrated the ethos of the 75th Ranger Regiment. While it is the job of the infantry line platoons to conduct combat operations, every Ranger, no matter what his specialty or specific job, must be prepared to fight and display the warrior spirit. The extreme circumstances and maelstrom of the battle on this day in Mogadishu would now require them to live up to the Ranger Creed. So that's it. All the boys are getting in the game.
Everybody, yeah. Everybody's getting put into this next convoy now because as we talked about, they cut forces before we deployed to Mogadishu, so we went in there very lean, and everything was in the fight. And we only had so many ace cards we could throw. We threw the combat search and rescue team. We threw the ground convoy. The ground convoy failed, so now we got to put together what we got left. And literally, guys coming out of the TOC. The operations sergeant major, the clerks, literally, those guys getting on board and trying to go back out.
Fast forward, Major Nixon, the senior officer, quickly briefed the convoy, and immediately they set out. They're heading towards the crash site of Super 6-4. As the second convoy approached the traffic circle, smoking military vehicles could be seen approaching from the south. Nixon brought the convoy abruptly to a halt and directed them to temporary positions. The turret gunners kept covering fire as what was left of the first Ranger convoy, now led by Gallagher after McKnight had been wounded, began arriving at the traffic circle. The sight of the first convoy was shocking, with vehicles piled high carrying heaps of wounded on top of the dead and every vehicle badly damaged. As the two groups of Rangers began to link up, it was obvious the situation was critical for the survivors of the first convoy, and they needed assistance to make it back to the airfield. Nixon, McKnight, and Gallagher briefly gathered around the vehicles in the middle of the street near the traffic circle. The decision was made to help the first convoy get its survivors back to the airfield and reorganize there for another try to reach the crash site of Super 6-4. That's a scene.
Yeah.
This one convoy just all shot up, a bunch of wounded, a bunch of dead, killed in action, wounded in action, and they happened to cross each other at this intersection and have a quick powwow.
Yeah, and again, obviously, I was out with the assault force. We were doing our thing on the first crash site, but I got most of this account from the guys that I mentioned in the book. Did a bunch of interviews with them, and from what I'd seen and I've read from the AARs and all that. So that's where I was able to pull this account from together, talking to most of the guys that were there. And one of the reactions to that convoy that I get universally when I talk to people is just like stunned shock. When you see a number of convoy vehicles roll up in bodies just stacked and blood literally pouring out of the vehicles, just stunned shock.
Once back inside the compound, the Rangers of the second convoy and base medical personnel swarmed around the damaged vehicles, carrying off the wounded and unloading the dead. The scenes inside the bullet-riddled, blood-covered vehicles were hellacious, stunning many of the Rangers and operators. While the casualties were quickly unloaded, the Somali prisoners who remained unhurt were put in the holding pen. After doing what they could for their wounded comrades, the second convoy began to reform. They were rejoined by surviving Rangers and operators of the first convoy. So these boys that just came back from the first convoy, barely, load up again.
That's right. And you talk to them, and a lot of them will tell you that's where it really took reaching down, knowing you're going to go back into the same thing with the same odds. It really took some reaching down, but knowing that we were still out there motivated them.
As the convoy rolled out of the gate, it was immediately engaged by heavy gunfire from the Somalis. It soon became obvious they would be unable to penetrate the second crash site. With little no hope of success on their current attempt, Nixon ordered them back to the airfield. Rangers and Delta operators who had survived the first two convoys now began integrating into the larger United Nations effort. Finally, late in the night, various American units were combined with the Pakistani tanks and Malaysian armored cars, and the convoy set off north of the city, and that's with the 10th Mountain Division. So this is when we finally get and there's a lot of political things going on here. You talked about the ownership of the battle space. This is a UN battle space.
Right.
And to get the support that they needed, it took some time.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting dynamics, in the UN coalition that we talk about in the book, but one of them is, You had like Pakistani military units and Indian military units, Greek military units and Turkish military units, and so now you're trying to ask enemies to come together and fight. And so I'm actually very appreciative of the Pakistanis and the Malaysians because they didn't sign up for QRF. That wasn't their job. And they just got kind of woken up in the middle of the night and said, hey, can you bring your tanks and bring your armored vehicles and go out into this fight? And I'm very appreciative of the fact that they did that. But the difficulties in trying to get that together, and again, we have a different culture of wanting to go into that fight. There was a little bit more hesitancy to go out into that fight, let's just say, across the board among people. So it took some urging to get them all to go out.
Back at the first crash site with the assault force, more wounded were brought into the casualty collection point and laid all around me. The Rangers and Delta operators continued to furiously and methodically clear the streets and courtyards immediately around us. The devastating fire of the little birds continued to chew into the neighborhoods as we fortified the short stretch of buildings we occupied and consolidated into a tight perimeter. Daylight began to fade, but the fight continued. The decision not to bring night vision goggles is now proving costly. There were a few sets available, mainly taken from the wreck of the helicopter. Still, the night gave us other advantages. We put our strobe lights out and used lasers, actually making it easier for the orbiting aircraft to identify our positions in the daytime. It's a big lesson learned. That one definitely got passed down. If you're going out, bring freaking night vision. Doesn't matter what time it is.
Yeah, 100%. And again, I can't say it enough. Given the choice again, I would have brought my night vision with me. But I do want to say there was a bit of a rationale. And so let's go back to the 90-foot fast rope. And so every single mission we went on, we had to evaluate, what are you going to bring because we're maxed out on gear. And you're going to be sliding down. There's only so much you can carry on that fast rope. And so 3:30 in the afternoon, we made the decision to bring more bullets and hand grenades. So it wasn't a case of being lazy or negligent. It was, am I going to bring water, night vision, or bullets and hand grenades? And that day, I chose bullets and hand grenades. And in retrospect, I certainly would have brought water and night vision.
How much water did you bring?
I didn't bring any. And so I got to sample the fruits of local sewer water. So thank God we did have a few tablets we could put in the water. But yeah, we drank basically out of the well right there in that house that we stormed into. So again, I mean, everything was geared toward, I got to slide down this rope with this weight. And so what am I going to bring? Again, can't emphasize enough, have night vision with you and water.
You ever been a heat casualty?
Just about, yeah.
I almost was. I was in the mountains of Arkansas, and we did like a link up, over one mountain ridge with a fire team. Then we linked up with a squad. Then we linked up with a platoon. Well, it started off solo operation, so I linked up with my swim buddy, and then eventually, but we kept going over these. I'm looking at my map. I'm like, okay, over this next ridge line, when we get down to the bottom, there's a stream. And I'll be able to refill my canteen. There wasn't no stream.
Yeah.
Next, 8 hours later, another ridge line, sweating like crazy. Get down to the bottom of the next one, looking for the stream. There's no stream. This happened 3 times, and I was out of water. And I was like, oh no, I'm gonna be a heat casualty.
Yeah.
Like I'm majorly, because I sweat a lot anyways. And after that, I was so paranoid about water for the rest of my freaking career. Because luckily we got to the 4th ridge line, to the 4th gully or whatever, and there was a stream. And boy, I was the squad leader. And I'm like, set perimeter.
Yeah,
I'm like,
right.
Set perimeter. Right. And we stayed there for a good while.
Yeah.
Refilling and drinking. Meanwhile, Black Hawk approached, trying to provide some resupply. It almost could get shot down. While unavoidable, this decision, because now once this resupply halo comes in and it almost gets shot down, it's like you're not getting any CASEVAC.
Yeah, it actually got damaged so badly it crashed back at the airfield and was out of commission. So yeah, they said no, we're not going to extract anybody.
While unavoidable, the decision proved tragically fatal for Corporal Jamie Smith, who had sat to my right on Super 6-4 and had been alongside me in the perimeter early in the day. After we'd moved away from the target building, as the combined group moved toward the crash site, Smith had pushed ahead with other members of his squad. During the furious fighting around the crash site, an AK-47 round tore through his pelvis and severed his femoral artery. Smith had fought to hang on for hours, but despite the medics' struggle to keep him alive in the dark hours of the night, he finally gave his life. From the time we established the perimeter and continuing throughout the night, the question was repeatedly asked about reinforcements. When will the QRF get here? Through the night, I lay in the casualty collection point, my leg a dull throb through a morphine haze as I listened to Captain Steele on the radio. Our position was an island in a sea of Somali attacks. We knew that our comrades continued the fight around us, would never give up or let anything penetrate into our tiny perimeter. We also had the little birds overhead with the comforting rip of the Gatling guns and boom of their rockets. But we needed help, more Americans to get in the fight, and help get our wounded and dead out and back to the airfield. Over the coming hours, as the assault force hung onto the perimeter around the first crash site, we slowly received reports of these efforts and continued to wait. Finally, we heard the thunderous approach of the relief convoy. We could mark its progress as it drew closer by the amount of firing we could hear. The noise grew in intensity to a crescendo as it crept forward from intersection to intersection. The convoy was laying down a tremendous amount of firepower as it moved slowly and methodically through Somali neighborhoods. Our anxiety rose as the last thing we wanted was to get blown away by the 50 cals and Mark 19s of the 10th Mountain Troops and the mixed force of the UN convoy. Deliberate instructions and warnings were passed to the convoy before one brave ranger ran out from the crash site to mark our position with additional chem lights as a recognition signal. A few more minutes passed until we heard vehicles racing up the alley. American Humvees arrived first and moved through our position and passed us to the wreckage of Super 6-1. Next came heavily armored cars from the Malaysian army. Finally, as the morning broke and the sky began to get lighter, everyone who could be loaded was loaded, and the convoy lurched forward. Somali fire increased, and the Malaysian gunner above me in the turret squeezed off bursts of his machine gun, raining me with hot shell casings. Riding inside those vehicles, what we did not know was that there had not been enough room on the Humvees and armored cars for all of the task force. The unwounded Rangers and Delta operators were forced to trail the convoy on foot, running through the streets and across intersections. The final push to safety has become known as the Mogadishu Mile and is often commemorated today with road races and endurance events. After a tense, halting drive out of the neighborhoods with the Somali fire increasing, things suddenly began to grow quieter outside. The Malaysian vehicles made a last turn and surged through the gates of the soccer stadium before coming to an abrupt halt. We were inside the stadium housing the Pakistani army contingent, and I knew that a portion of our ordeal was over. What time is it you get back there? It's like 6 or something like that in the morning?
Yeah, it's sometime between 6 and 8, sometime that. The sun was definitely up, and it's just, again, one of those kind of metaphorical things almost, is when the back of that armored vehicle opened up and the sunlight came in, it was just kind of amazing. I mean, the world was different, and huge relief, to look down out and see guys from the task force. And we didn't know the whole story, and we didn't know what was going on, but we knew we'd survived. We knew it happened to us, and that we'd survived. And then it just kind of started to hit us there. The impact of as we assembled back at that stadium and began to see kind of the results of what had gone on.
But a lot of the other casualties have been taken back to the airfield. Is that right?
Well, some from the convoy.
Okay.
So some from the convoy have been taken back there, but basically everybody that had been wounded out at the target building and in the fight around our crash site was there at the Pakistani stadium. So, we talk about it in the book, but there was stretchers lined up on both sides of that soccer field. I mean, it just really was an impact to see that many stretchers lined up on both sides of the soccer field, and then look down at the end and see the guys that had been killed wrapped up in ponchos. And we'd heard about a couple guys getting killed, as reports are coming in and things. We just didn't have it. You didn't know the scope or scale of the fight until you saw that. That's when it really hit me.
Fast forward a little bit. Almost immediately, medics approached me and began to check my wound. I was still worried about the bleeding, and I knew I'd lost a lot of blood. As the medevac helicopters began to cycle in to land on the soccer field, I told the medics I'd been hit the day before around 1700. So then you get labeled a priority. They put you on the next U.S. helicopter. You end up at the 46th Combat Support Hospital, straight to pre-op. Fast forward, I woke hours later being wheeled into a long green army tent and immediately recognized everyone in the beds around me. The tent was full of wounded Rangers and Delta operators, most of them heavily bandaged with every kind of wound. That night, we heard incoming fire in the distance and machine guns on the nearby guard posts opening up along the perimeter. With no weapons and wearing only a hospital gown, I began to feel vulnerable again. The next morning, things got better. When more visitors from TF Ranger came over from the airfield, it was reassuring to see our comrades from TF Ranger still confident and ready to take the fight back out to the enemy, especially where our missing comrades were concerned. The Rangers and Delta operators in the hospital who were lightly wounded were similarly anxious to get back to the unit and into the line. However, we had been profoundly changed and were still absorbing the shock of battle. On missions prior to the raid on October 3rd, we had made scattered contact with the enemy and even taken some wounded, but we were not convinced that made us, quote, combat veterans. Those encounters just didn't seem to meet the threshold of our expectations passed on to us from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. But after the battle on October 3rd and 4th, the issue was beyond doubt, as if we had passed over a chasm and there was no going back.
Yeah, and the other thing is, too, that really started to be imbued or was imbued in us at this point was very tribal. I mean, there was a lot of other units and a lot of other people involved, but I just wanted Task Force Ranger guys around me. And when I was in a position like I was in the hospital and I wasn't protected by Task Force Ranger guys, I was got a lot of anxiety. And it lasted all the way back to the U.S., So, and that manifests itself today, but like anytime I come across a guy from Task Force Ranger, whether I liked the guy or not, there's this immediate bond, like, oh, I know you got my back. So, but that was really at that point there was a lot of apprehension about that because I needed Task Force Ranger guys around me.
You end up on a C-141 transport. That when you end up in the hospital, you get a TV, and this is when you see Mike Durant for the first time. He's on, that's all circulating around, tracking that story.
Yeah, and it's again, I'll bring it up again too. We know the story now because everybody's seen the movie, and 30 years later. But at the time, we didn't know probably 50% of this story. We knew a few things that had happened to us. Things were slowly coming together, but I did not know what had happened to Super 6-4. I knew he got shot down, but that's all I knew. Didn't know if anybody had survived. So to see Mike come across on the news like that was shocking and really relief at the same time.
Mm-hmm. How'd you feel about his chances? Because I know when I saw him, I was like, oh, there's no way this guy's going to stay alive. No offense, Mike, if you're listening. But that's what I was thinking at the time. What were you thinking?
Yeah, again, it goes back to we just didn't have a lot of faith in the overall system. We went in there with all the faith in the world that, the United States in general is invincible, and now it's coming down to, it's all about Task Force Ranger. And so I wanted to think there was going to be an effort to get him out, but again, I was apprehensive, like you mentioned.
You eventually get some good advice, so you get... Probably worth bringing up. You mentioned earlier that the Army's not always going to look out for your best interests, and one of the doctors told you that all hospitals were not created equal, and if you could, get to Walter Reed Army Medical.
Yeah. I would say one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten. And so kind of one of the themes of the book at this point is just to sing the praises of the military medical system. There's a lot of support units and combat guys joke about support pogues and stuff. But the medical service and the military medical system is absolutely outstanding. I mean, they really are the best military trauma care in the world. And again, I didn't know any of this at the time, but what somebody told me was, all hospitals aren't the same. Walter Reed on the East Coast and Tripler on the West Coast are the tip of the pyramid. There's a hierarchy and a tip of a pyramid, and they were 100% right. I mean, I just can't emphasize that was the best care I could have ever gotten was to go to Walter Reed. So I was fortunate to be able to make that choice and go there, because what they were offering you was to go home to your home station and be done.
That's got to be tempting.
Very tempting to go home and see my wife and my family and get back there to my stuff, my home. But be treated at the local Fort Benning Hospital. And it's not a dig on the Fort Benning Hospital. They just don't have near the resources. Walter Reed is equipped to be the superpower of medical centers. And so I took that choice to go up there because the issue with my leg was, they didn't know if they're going to be able to keep it or not. So.
After spending the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays with my family, I returned to Walter Reed for the next round of surgeries, continuing rebuilding my leg. While the surgeons had been able to close the massive wounds, there still remained the problem of a 4-inch gap in my tibia or shin bone. My team of orthopedic surgeons decided to rebuild my leg using some extreme and near miraculous medical procedures. During hours of surgery, they started by opening my back near the waist. Then they hammered chunks out of my pelvis until they got enough bone material to pack in and fill the gap between my intact upper and lower parts of my tibia. Over time, the living bone would fuse with the material that had been packed into the gap, recalcifying and eventually completely absorbing it, creating new bone. While this miraculous process eventually succeeded, it was a very tough surgery that not only included reopening my leg wound, but now my back and pelvis as well. It was successful, but left me unable to get out of bed again. With new wounds in my back, I was restricted to lying on my side. That's crazy.
Yeah, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Again, miraculous medical treatment that they came up with at Walter Reed. Some of the stuff was the first time they'd ever used it on some of our guys. They put what's called an Elizarov device on my leg. It's like 2 bicycle rims, and then they would drill the spokes through the bone to stabilize that and create this cage that I could walk on. And then what was tough about it was I could get to a point where I could walk again. And but then I had to go back in for more surgery, and that just knocked me right back down. So I was just bedridden again. So, and this is over a period of months and months and months. So it just took a lot of for me. It took a lot of fortitude to try to work my way through that and to keep trying to come back.
You're at home in Fort Benning for March. Your wife gives birth to your first daughter.
That's right. Yeah,
Carolina. You get promoted to captain. And you get to do that in front of 2 companies of your Ranger brothers. And meanwhile, the Army's being cool to you. You say no bureaucratic pressure from the Army, but the clock's ticking on your career. You have to go to advanced officer course. You graduate and go on to make a full recovery, continue to serve in the infantry and airborne units for many more years in many other wars. And I'll close it out with this. Again, get the book because there's so many details in here. You say, the Lord had answered my prayers. He had not only called me with near miraculous timing and circumstances to join B Company and Task Force Ranger, but it sustained me through the battle. He had brought me not only through the desperate fight and home to see my family, but the struggle afterward to recover. I knew that there was a reason for not only my survival, but my perseverance, and that the Lord had a continuing plan for me. So that's kind of the start of your career.
That's right. Yeah, that's the first big battle.
That trial,
first big operation.
That trial by fire was only the beginning.
Yeah.
You had a lot more work to do.
That's right. Yeah.
You have a lot more wars to fight. And I actually, in reading this, recognized that you and I would have a lot more to talk about. And we've already been over 3 hours.
Wow.
So we're going to save the rest of your career for the next podcast that we'll record directly. Echo, you got any questions?
Oh, yeah. Quick question. So your leg, they got bone from your hip.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of rebuilt, essentially, the missing bone.
That's right. Yeah.
In your shin.
All fused together and created a new bone.
And how is it now?
In some ways, it's stronger than it was. Amazingly, I parachuted on it. I went back to the infantry, so I road marched on it. Ran 2 marathons on it. So it's, yeah. I mean, I have some problems, but I don't think I have any problems that every other 58-year-old doesn't have. You know what I mean? So, So nothing I can complain about.
So when you say problems, like what? Like pain,
back stuff, and my knees feel messed up and all that stuff. But again, I think it's just par for the course.
Yeah, that's just how. So dang. Usually they put like a rod or something in there.
Yeah,
right? Something like that.
Yeah, there just wasn't enough left. Well, there was it was a gap, so it was nothing for them. They had to have some bone material to fill that 4-inch gap. Right. So
that's crazy. And you didn't walk with like a limp or no permanent limp, nothing like that.
No, not perceptible. You know? And I have a reason. I have an excuse for being slow on the run. So
kind of good to go. All right, cool. Yeah, good to meet you. Right on.
Yeah, you too.
Jim, any closing thoughts for this chapter?
Just a lot of themes. I appreciate you saying get the book, because there is a lot of detail in there that we didn't cover, and there's a lot of themes. But I wrote it for a number of reasons. I wrote it, one, because I've found over 30 years now, even though Black Hawk Down was pretty famous, there's a lot of people that haven't heard the story. And it's not my story I want to tell. I try to go into detail about the guys we lost, because they deserve that. That's why I think when you talk to a lot of guys, one of the things they hope is that people will remember them and appreciate their sacrifice. So I felt very strongly about trying to tell that story. Trying to clarify a few things. Like I said, the leadership or in the research I got to do on the book helped fill in some gaps. But I also think, our society today, everybody talks about making progress and being progressive. And there's obviously things in the military that have improved from a socio perspective. But I also think we've thrown out a lot of the things that were important. And I try to highlight that in the book. I mean, there's things the military have done for 2,500 years since the Spartans, and there's a reason that we've done it. And the military should not reflect directly society, no matter what society comes up with, what they want to accept and how they want to approach things and diversity and things like that. But there's a reason that there's a brotherhood. There's a reason that there's brutal and harsh training. There's a difference between abusing people and then training them for combat. And so I think our society today has thrown a lot of those things out. The baby with the bathwater. As we've made progress, we've forgotten about what it really takes to build a unit. And I've had a lot of experience with this, post Army, and as the military has started to evolve. And again, I just think the Army and the military have taken the wrong direction. The Citadel's taken the wrong direction on throwing out the good things and the historic things and the things that make units ready for combat. So I wanted to try to highlight some of those themes in the book, and I hope it's done that. So I appreciate you plugging that, and I hope people will go out and read that.
Yeah, we'll get into some of those lessons learned on the next podcast here. And yeah, the book, it's With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia. You're also on Twitter, X.
Yep, that's right.
At Lechner. It's LECHNER _Jim. How much do you do on Instagram?
I don't do a lot on X and Instagram. I started that when I became a correspondent for Newsmax. I started all my social media stuff up, but now it's a fine line on the different stuff that I do. So
yeah. Well, you're there, and again, I couldn't agree with you more. Sometimes as I see the way certain things go in society and the military, and you watch them going in a certain direction, and sometimes I ask myself, if we keep going in that direction, who's going to fight the wars?
That's right.
Because it takes a certain type of humans that are going to step up and fight the wars, and that's one thing that is so clear in your book. You did such a great job showing that in this situation, this terrible situation, these men stepped up with unmatched bravery and went above and beyond, all of them, to take care of their brothers out there on the battlefield. So it's an amazing book. Thanks for writing it. We'll get a little bit more into it on the next podcast, and then we'll talk about the rest of your career, which is a plenty more to talk about. Everyone that's listening, thanks for listening. You can support the podcast by going to jockofuel.com, originusa.com, jockostore.com, echelonfront.com. We're also on the interwebs. Echo is at Echo Charles. I'm at Jocko Willink. And thanks again, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Lechner, for your service and sacrifice. And all our military personnel out there, with a particular salute tonight to the Army Rangers. Outstanding,
Thank you.
Yeah, outstanding soldiers in every way, who earn their motto without a doubt: Rangers lead the way. And also thanks to our police, law enforcement, firefighters, paramedics, EMTs, dispatchers, correctional officers, Border Patrol, Secret Service, as well as all other first responders. Thanks to you for keeping us safe here at home. And to everyone else that's listening, remember that attitude from the Rangers Creed: I will shoulder more than my share of the task, whatever it may be. That's the goal. That's the standard. So train hard, be ready, and no matter what, fight on. And until next time, this is Lieutenant Colonel Jim Lechner and Echo and Jocko